the vast Bohemian basin enclosed by the Sudeten Mountains to the north and west, the Bohemian-Moravian highlands to the southeast, and the Bohemian forest to the southwest, witnessed one of medieval Europe's most significant demographic transformations during the 6th and 7th centuries. Germanic tribes, primarily the Marcomanni and later the Lombards, had dominated this fertile region for centuries, establishing settlements along the Elbe River and its tributaries. However, the great migrations that swept across Europe during the late antiquity period would fundamentally alter the ethnic and political landscape of Central Europe. The West Slavic migration into the Bohemian Basin represented part of a broader demographic shift that saw Slavic peoples expand westward from their presumed homeland in the Pripyat Marshes region of present-day Belarus and Ukraine. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first Slavic settlers began arriving in Bohemia around 550 AD, initially establishing small agricultural communities in river valleys where the soil proved most fertile. These early migrants brought with them a distinct material culture characterized by handmade pottery with simple geometric decorations, rectangular sunken floor dwellings, and iron agricultural tools that differed markedly from the Germanic artifacts found in earlier archaeological layers. The displacement of Germanic populations occurred gradually rather than through sudden conquest. Many Germanic settlements appear to have been abandoned peacefully, as their inhabitants migrated southward into Italy, or joined the expanding Lombard Confederation. The Slavic newcomers, organised in extended family groups called Zadruga *, settled primarily in areas that had been sparsely populated or recently abandoned. They established fortified settlements called Grads *, on elevated positions overlooking river valleys, constructing wooden palisades and earthworks that provided protection against raiders and rival tribes. By the early 7th century, distinct tribal groupings had emerged within the Bohemian Basin. The Czechs controlled the central and western portions of the region, establishing their primary strongholds along the Vltava River. To the east, smaller tribes such as the Lucane occupied territories around present-day Luni, while the Soven settled in the area that would later become Melnik. Each tribe maintained its own fortified centre, typically positioned on rocky outcrops or artificial mounds that commanded strategic river crossings and trade routes. The political organisation of these early Slavic tribes remained relatively simple, with authority concentrated in the hands of warrior chiefs who gained prominence through military success and their ability to distribute wealth among followers. These leaders, known by various titles including Nizer and Zupan, ruled over territories that rarely extended beyond a day's march from their fortified centres. Tribal assemblies of free warriors made decisions regarding warfare, major disputes, and the selection of new leaders, though the influence of established noble families grew increasingly important over time. The first major political consolidation in the region occurred under the leadership of Samo, a Frankish merchant who established a vast confederation spanning much of Central Europe between 623 and 658 AD. Historical sources, particularly the Chronicle of Fredegar, describe Samo as a trader who gained the trust of Slavic tribes through his commercial activities and eventually assumed leadership during their conflicts with the Avars. The Avar Khaganate, a powerful nomadic confederation based in the Pannonian Basin, had been extracting tribute from Slavic tribes and conducting slave raids throughout the region since the late 6th century. Samo's confederation represented a remarkable achievement in early medieval political organisation, uniting Slavic tribes across present-day Czech Republic, Slovakia, parts of Austria and Slovenia under a single authority. The Confederation's military strength became evident in 631 AD when Samo's forces defeated a major Frankish expedition led by King Dagobert first at the Battle of Rogastisberg. This victory demonstrated that the Slavic tribes had developed sufficient military organisation and equipment to challenge established powers, employing tactics that combined traditional Slavic infantry formations with cavalry units likely modelled on Avar examples. The location of Rogastisburg remains disputed among historians, with proposed sites including Ruben Hill near Podborony in northwestern Bohemia and various locations in present-day Austria. Archaeological evidence suggests that the battle involved several thousand warriors on each side, with Samo's forces utilising knowledge of local terrain to overcome the Frankish advantage in heavy cavalry and siege equipment. The defeat forced the Franks to abandon their immediate expansion plans eastward and recognise Samo's confederation as a legitimate political entity. Following Samo's death around 658 AD, his confederation fragmented into constituent tribal territories, though the precedent of supra-tribal political organisation had been established. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals increasing social stratification within Slavic communities, with elite burials containing imported goods, weapons, and jewellery that distinguished prominent families from ordinary farmers and craftsmen. These emerging noble lineages would provide the foundation for more permanent political structures in subsequent centuries. The legendary origins of the Premyslid dynasty emerged from this period of tribal consolidation, though separating historical fact from later mythological elaboration presents significant challenges. According to the Chronicle of Cosmas of Prague, written in the early 12th century and other medieval sources, the Czechs initially governed themselves through tribal assemblies until internal conflicts necessitated the selection of a single ruler. The most famous version of this legend centres on Princess Lebuse, described as the youngest daughter of Judge Krok, who possessed prophetic abilities and served as a wise arbitrator of disputes. Lebuse's legendary court was situated at Libusin, possibly located near present-day Tetin Castle, south of Prague, where she dispensed justice and guided the Czech tribe through her supernatural wisdom. Medieval chroniclers attributed to her the prophecy regarding Prague's future greatness, describing her vision of a great city where a man would be building the threshold of his house, and that this place should be called Prague, from the word pra, meaning threshold. While clearly legendary, this narrative reflects genuine memories of female authority in early Slavic society, where women could inherit property and exercise political influence under certain circumstances. The transition from Lebuse's rule to that of Premysl the Ploughman represents a crucial element in Czech dynastic mythology. According to tradition, when the Czech nobles demanded a male ruler, Lebuse instructed them to follow her horse to find their future prince. The horse led them to Premysl, a simple farmer ploughing his field near the village of Stadis. Premysl's humble origins symbolised the democratic selection of leadership, while his agricultural occupation emphasised the connection between legitimate authority and the land's fertility. Archaeological investigations at Stadis have revealed evidence of early medieval settlement, including pottery fragments and iron tools consistent with 8th century occupation, though no definitive proof of the legendary Premysl's existence has been discovered. The symbolic importance of the legend lies in its establishment of the Premyslid dynasty's legitimacy through both divine selection and popular consent, themes that would resonate throughout medieval Bohemian political culture. The historical emergence of the Premyslid dynasty can be traced more reliably to the 9th century, when documentary sources begin providing concrete information about Bohemian rulers. The earliest historically attested Premyslid leader was probably Bořivoj I, who ruled during the latter half of the 9th century and initiated the dynasty's rise to regional dominance. Bořivoj's reign coincided with the expansion of Great Moravia under Svatopluk I, creating complex political dynamics that would shape Bohemian development for generations. Bořivoj's conversion to Christianity, traditionally dated to around 883 AD, marked a watershed moment in Bohemian history. According to later sources, he received baptism from Saint Methodius, one of the Byzantine missionaries who had introduced Christianity to Great Moravia. This conversion carried profound political implications, aligning Bořivoj with the Moravian court while potentially alienating traditional pagan elements within his own tribe. Archaeological evidence from Prague Castle, where Bořivoj established his primary residence, reveals the construction of the first Christian church in Bohemia during this period, a small rotunda dedicated to the Virgin Mary. The strategic location of Prague Castle, perched on a rocky promontory overlooking the Vltava River, provided Bořivoj with control over crucial trade routes connecting southern Germany with Poland and the Baltic region. Merchants travelling in these routes carried amber, furs, slaves and salt, generating customs revenues that strengthened Premyslid authority. The castle's fortifications, initially consisting of wooden palisades and earthworks, were gradually expanded to accommodate growing administrative needs and provide refuge for surrounding populations during conflicts. Bořivoj's political consolidation involved both diplomatic manoeuvring and military action against rival tribal leaders. He formed alliances with some Czech nobles while eliminating others who threatened his authority. The process required careful balance between innovation and tradition, introducing new administrative practices borrowed from Moravian and Frankish examples, while respecting established customs regarding property rights and tribal governance. His success in maintaining this balance enabled the Premyslids to survive the collapse of Great Moravia in the early 10th century and emerge as the dominant force in Bohemian politics. The gradual unification of Bohemian tribes under Premyslid leadership accelerated during the reigns of Bořivoj's successors. His son Spitinev first continued the consolidation process, extending Premyslid control over previously independent tribal territories through a combination of military conquest, marriage alliances, and economic incentives. Archaeological evidence suggests that many tribal strongholds were abandoned during this period as their populations relocated to settlements under direct Premyslid authority. The integration of diverse tribal groups required sophisticated administrative innovations. The Premyslids established a network of fortified administrative centres called hradiště, each governed by appointed officials responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and organising military levies. These centres served as focal points for economic activity, attracting craftsmen and merchants who benefited from the security provided by Premyslid authority. The resulting concentration of population and resources enabled more efficient tax collection and military organisation than had been possible under the earlier tribal system. Religious policy played a crucial role in the unification process. While the Premyslids had embraced Christianity, many of their subjects remained attached to traditional Slavic religious practices. Rather than attempting forcible conversion, early Premyslid rulers adopted a pragmatic approach that tolerated pagan customs while gradually introducing Christian institutions. Churches were constructed at major administrative centres, but pagan sacred sites were often incorporated into Christian contexts rather than destroyed outright. The economic foundations of Premyslid power rested on agriculture, trade, and craft production. The fertile soils of the Bohemian basin supported extensive grain cultivation, while forested areas provided timber, honey, and game. Iron ore deposits in the Bohemian Moravian highlands enabled the development of metallurgy, producing weapons, tools, and ornamental objects that enhanced both military capability and diplomatic prestige. Silver mining began during this period, though large-scale extraction would not develop until later centuries. Trade relationships extended throughout Central Europe and beyond. Bohemian merchants travelled to Byzantine markets via the Danube River, while others ventured north to the Baltic coast or west to Frankish territories. These commercial connections brought foreign goods, ideas, and technologies to Bohemia while providing markets for local products. The Premyslids regulated and taxed this trade, using customs revenues to fund their expanding administration and military forces. The death of Spitinev, first around 915 AD, brought his younger brother Wenceslas to the Premyslid throne, At a moment when Bohemia faced unprecedented challenges from multiple directions, Magyar raiders swept across the Pannonian Basin with increasing frequency, their mounted archers penetrating deep into Bohemian territory to seize captives and livestock. Simultaneously, the Saxon dukes of the emerging Ottonian dynasty pressed eastward from their base along the Elbe River, seeking to extend Frankish influence over the Slavic tribes that had previously acknowledged Moravian suzerainty. Within Bohemia itself, noble factions questioned whether the young duke possessed sufficient military experience to defend their territories against these external threats. Wenceslas approached these challenges with a strategy that emphasized diplomatic solutions over military confrontation. Rather than matching the aggressive posture of neighbouring rulers, he pursued a careful policy of accommodation with stronger powers, while strengthening internal cohesion through religious and administrative reforms. His court at Prague Castle became a centre of Christian learning, where Slavonic liturgy coexisted with Latin traditions, reflecting his attempt to balance Byzantine and Roman influences within Bohemian Christianity. Scholars trained in Great Moravian schools continued their work under Premyslid patronage, producing illuminated manuscripts and maintaining libraries that preserved both religious texts and secular knowledge. The Duke's commitment to Christian principles shaped his approach to governance in ways that sometimes conflicted with traditional noble expectations. He established hospices for travellers and the poor, funded the construction of churches in rural areas, and attempted to regulate the slave trade that had become a major source of revenue for Bohemian warriors. These policies reflected genuine religious conviction, but also served practical political purposes by demonstrating his alignment with Christian rulers throughout Europe, and attracting support from ecclesiastical authorities who could provide diplomatic backing. Wenceslas's relationship with his younger brother Boleslaus revealed growing tensions within the Premyslid family regarding the direction of Bohemian policy. Boleslaus commanded significant support among nobles who favoured more aggressive expansion and resented what they perceived as excessive accommodation to foreign demands. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites associated with Boleslaus suggests that he maintained his own military retinue and administrative apparatus, creating a parallel power structure that challenged ducal authority. The brothers' rivalry reflected broader divisions within Bohemian society between those who benefited from peaceful trade relationships and warrior elites whose status depended on successful raiding and territorial conquest. The crisis came to a head in September 929 AD, when Boleslaus invited Wenceslas to celebrate the feast of Saints Cosmas and Damian at his stronghold in Stara Boleslav. Contemporary sources, including the earliest Vita of Saint Wenceslas, written within decades of his death, describe how the invitation concealed a carefully planned assassination. On the morning of September 28th, as Wenceslas approached the church for morning prayers, Boleslaus confronted him outside the building's entrance. The confrontation quickly escalated into violence, with Boleslaus drawing his sword and striking his brother down on the church steps. Several of Boleslaus's supporters joined the attack, ensuring that Wenceslas died before he could seek sanctuary within the sacred building. The assassination's immediate aftermath revealed the extent of planning behind the conspiracy. Boleslaus had already secured support from key nobles and military commanders, enabling him to assume control of Prague Castle and other strategic locations without significant resistance. However, the murder of a Christian ruler at a church entrance created profound religious and political complications that would haunt Boleslaus's reign for years. Reports of miracles at Wenceslas's tomb began circulating almost immediately, with pilgrims claiming that prayers offered at his burial site resulted in healings and other supernatural interventions. The transformation of Wenceslas from political failure to martyred saint occurred with remarkable speed, driven by both popular devotion and calculated political manipulation. Boleslaus initially attempted to suppress the growing cult, but opposition from ecclesiastical authorities and pressure from neighbouring Christian rulers forced him to accommodate the veneration of his murdered brother. By 935 AD, Wenceslas's remains had been transferred to Prague's Church of St. Vitus, where they were enshrined in an elaborate tomb that became a pilgrimage destination. The development of his cult provided Bohemia with its first native saint while establishing a religious foundation for Premyslid legitimacy that transcended political divisions. Boleslaus I's consolidation of power required immediate attention to external threats that had intensified during the succession crisis. Saxon forces under Henry the Fowler had exploited Bohemian instability to establish fortified positions along the northern frontier, while Magyar raiders increased their penetration into Bohemian territory. The new duke's response demonstrated the military competence that had attracted noble support for his coup. He reorganized Bohemian forces around heavily armoured cavalry units, modelled on Frankish examples, while maintaining traditional Slavic infantry formations equipped with spears, axes, and round shields decorated with geometric patterns. The confrontation with Saxon expansion came to a head in 936 AD when Otto I, who had succeeded his father Henry as Saxon duke, launched a major expedition into Bohemian territory. Otto's forces included not only Saxon warriors, but also contingents from Franconia and Bavaria, representing the emerging coalition that would eventually form the core of the Holy Roman Empire. The campaign aimed to force Bohemian submission to Saxon overlordship while demonstrating Otto's capability to project power beyond traditional Frankish boundaries. Boleslaus's response revealed sophisticated understanding of contemporary military tactics and political dynamics. Rather than meeting the Saxon army in open battle where their superior heavy cavalry would provide decisive advantages, he adopted a defensive strategy that utilised Bohemia's natural geographic advantages. Bohemian forces withdrew to fortified positions in mountainous terrain, forcing the Saxons to assault prepared defences while operating far from their supply bases. Simultaneously, Boleslaus negotiated with Magyar leaders, offering them safe passage through Bohemian territory in exchange for raids against Saxon positions. The resulting campaign proved inconclusive from a military perspective, but established important precedents for future Bohemian-Saxon relations. Otto's forces captured several fortified positions and extracted tribute from areas under their temporary control, but they could not achieve the complete conquest necessary to establish permanent Saxon administration. Boleslaus retained control of Prague and other major strongholds while demonstrating his ability to resist external pressure. The campaign's conclusion through negotiated settlement rather than decisive military victory created a framework for ongoing diplomatic engagement between the two powers. The agreement reached between Otto and Boleslaus in 937 AD established Bohemia's position within the expanding Ottonian sphere of influence, while preserving significant internal autonomy. Boleslaus acknowledged Saxon suzerainty and agreed to provide military assistance for Otto's campaigns, but he retained control over internal Bohemian affairs including taxation, legal administration, and ecclesiastical appointments. This arrangement reflected Otto's pragmatic recognition that direct Saxon rule over Bohemia would require military resources better deployed elsewhere, while providing Boleslaus with external legitimacy that strengthened his position against domestic opponents. The integration of Bohemia into Otto's imperial system accelerated following his coronation as Holy Roman Emperor in 962 AD. Boleslaus participated in several of Otto's Italian campaigns, leading Bohemian contingents that demonstrated their military effectiveness in diverse geographic and tactical environments. These expeditions provided Bohemian warriors with combat experience against different opponents while exposing them to new military technologies and organisational methods. The campaigns also generated significant booty that Boleslaus distributed among his followers, reinforcing their loyalty and funding further military improvements. Bohemian participation in imperial campaigns created opportunities for territorial expansion that Boleslaus exploited with considerable skill. During Otto's absence in Italy, Magyar pressure on the empire's eastern frontiers intensified, culminating in their devastating defeat at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955 AD. The Magyar collapse created a power vacuum in the Pannonian Basin that neighbouring rulers rushed to fill. Boleslaus moved quickly to establish Bohemian control over territories in present-day Slovakia and parts of Hungary, extending Premyslid authority far beyond its traditional boundaries. The expansion eastward brought Bohemia into direct conflict with Poland, where the Piast dynasty under Mieszko first was pursuing similar territorial ambitions. Both rulers sought control over the lucrative trade routes connecting the Baltic with the Danube, while attempting to subjugate Slavic tribes that had previously maintained independence. The resulting conflicts involved not only direct military confrontation, but also complex diplomatic manoeuvring, as each side sought allies among neighbouring powers and attempted to exploit internal divisions within rival territories. The Polish-Bohemian rivalry intensified during the 960s as both powers consolidated their gains from Magyar territorial losses. Archaeological evidence from contested border regions reveals extensive fortification construction during this period, with both sides establishing networks of castles and watchtowers designed to control strategic river crossings and mountain passes. These fortifications incorporated architectural innovations borrowed from Byzantine and Western European examples, including stone foundations, advanced gate systems, and specialized defensive structures adapted to local terrain conditions. Military encounters between Polish and Bohemian forces demonstrated the evolution of Slavic warfare from its early medieval origins. Both armies employed mixed formations combining heavy cavalry, infantry and archer units, with tactics adapted to specific battlefield conditions. Siege warfare became increasingly important, as conflicts centred on the capture of fortified positions rather than open-field battles. The development of siege techniques required specialised equipment and engineering knowledge, leading to the recruitment of foreign experts and the establishment of workshops capable of producing complex military machinery. Boleslaus's territorial ambitions extended beyond the eastern frontiers to encompass regions that would later form parts of Austria and southern Germany. His forces established control over strategic alpine passes that provided access to Italian markets, while Bohemian influence extended into areas along the Danube River, where local Slavic populations welcomed Premyslid protection against Magyar raids. These expansions created a Bohemian sphere of influence that rivaled the territorial extent achieved by Great Moravia at its zenith. The administrative challenges posed by territorial expansion required significant innovations in governmental organisation. Boleslaus established a hierarchical system of appointed governors responsible for specific regions, each supported by military garrisons and administrative staff drawn from the growing class of educated clergy and noble retainers. These regional administrators collected taxes, maintained order, and organised military levies according to standardised procedures that ensured consistent implementation of ducal policies across diverse territories. The development of castle networks provided the physical infrastructure necessary for effective territorial control. Major fortifications were constructed at strategic locations, including river confluences, mountain passes, and trade route intersections. These castles served multiple functions as military strongholds, administrative centres, and economic hubs where local populations could seek protection during conflicts. The largest installations included separate residential quarters for noble families, workshops for craftsmen, storage facilities for agricultural surplus, and chapels for religious services. Boleslaus's death around 967 AD brought his son Boleslaus second to power during a period of continued territorial expansion and internal consolidation. The new duke inherited a realm that extended far beyond the original Bohemian tribal territories, while facing ongoing challenges from Polish expansion and Hungarian recovery. His early reign focused on securing the eastern frontiers against Polish encroachment, while maintaining the delicate balance between imperial obligations and Bohemian autonomy that his father had established. The younger Boleslaus demonstrated even greater territorial ambitions than his predecessor, launching campaigns that extended Bohemian control deep into present-day Slovakia and southern Poland. His forces captured Krakow around 999 AD, establishing Bohemian authority over one of the most important commercial centres in Central Europe. The capture of Krakow provided access to the extensive trade networks connecting the Baltic with the Black Sea while demonstrating Bohemian military superiority over Polish forces. Archaeological evidence from Krakow reveals extensive construction projects undertaken during the Bohemian occupation, including fortification improvements and the establishment of administrative buildings. The expansion of Bohemian territory created new opportunities for economic development and cultural exchange. Trade revenues increased substantially as Bohemian merchants gained access to previously restricted markets, while the incorporation of diverse populations introduced new crafts and technologies. Silver mining expanded significantly during this period, with new extraction sites developed in mountainous regions under Bohemian control. The increased availability of silver enabled more sophisticated monetary systems, while providing resources for military expansion and architectural projects. Religious policy during the reigns of both Boleslaus rulers reflected the complex relationship between political expansion and Christian conversion. The establishment of Bohemian control over new territories required careful attention to existing religious practices and ecclesiastical structures. In areas with established Christian communities, Bohemian administrators generally maintained existing church organizations while ensuring their loyalty to Prague. Pagan populations were encouraged but not forced to convert, with conversion often following the establishment of new churches and the arrival of missionary clergy. The foundation of the Prague bishopric in 973 AD represented the culmination of decades of ecclesiastical development within Bohemia. Emperor Otto II's approval of the new diocese reflected both Bohemian political importance within the imperial system and the maturation of Christian institutions under Premyslid patronage. The first bishop, Detmar, had been educated in German schools, but demonstrated sensitivity to local traditions by maintaining Slavonic liturgical practices alongside Latin ceremonies. The establishment of episcopal authority provided Bohemia with greater ecclesiastical autonomy, while strengthening ties to the broader European Christian community. The new bishopric's jurisdiction extended throughout Bohemian territories, including recently conquered regions where Christian institutions remained underdeveloped. Bishop Detmar initiated an ambitious program of church construction and clerical education designed to provide adequate religious services for the expanding population under Bohemian rule. Rural parishes were established in areas that had previously lacked regular access to Christian sacraments, while urban centres received new churches capable of accommodating growing congregations. The bishop also founded schools for training local clergy, reducing dependence on foreign-educated priests while ensuring adequate knowledge of both theological doctrine and administrative procedures. The ecclesiastical reorganisation initiated by Bishop Detmar established the institutional framework that would support Bohemia's transformation from a peripheral duchy into one of Central Europe's most influential kingdoms. The death of Boleslaus II around 999 AD coincided with broader political upheavals throughout the region, as the Ottonian imperial system faced challenges from resurgent Polish power under Boleslaw the Brave and Hungarian expansion under Stephen I. These external pressures, combined with internal succession disputes within the Premyslid dynasty, created a period of instability that would ultimately reshape Bohemian political structures and territorial boundaries. The succession crisis that followed Boleslaus II's death revealed fundamental weaknesses in the Premyslid system of governance. Unlike the clearly defined primogeniture that characterized some Western European dynasties, Bohemian succession practices retained elements of tribal tradition where multiple family members could claim legitimate authority. Boleslaus III, who initially secured control of Prague Castle, faced immediate challenges from his brothers Jaromir and Aldrich, each of whom controlled significant territorial bases and commanded loyal military followings. The resulting civil war fragmented Bohemian territories just as external enemies prepared to exploit the kingdom's internal divisions. Polish forces under Boleslaw the Brave moved swiftly to reclaim territories lost during the previous decades of Bohemian expansion. The recapture of Krakow in 1003 AD eliminated Bohemian influence in southern Poland, while providing Poland with crucial trade revenues previously controlled by Prague. Boleslaw's campaigns extended beyond mere territorial recovery to encompass a systematic effort to establish Polish hegemony over the Slavic lands between the Oder and Danube rivers. His forces captured Prague itself in 1003, forcing Boleslaus III into exile and installing Vladivoj, a member of the collateral Premyslid line, as a Polish client ruler. The Polish occupation of Bohemia lasted only until 1004, but its brief duration concealed profound impacts on Bohemian political development. Boleslaw's administration introduced new governmental practices borrowed from his experiences in imperial service, including more systematic tax collection procedures and standardized legal codes. These innovations survived the restoration of independent Premyslid rule and influenced subsequent administrative reforms. Archaeological evidence from Prague reveals construction projects initiated during the Polish period, including fortification improvements and the expansion of craft workshops that enhanced the city's economic capabilities. The restoration of Premyslid authority under Jaromir in 1004 required extensive negotiations with Emperor Henry II, who had succeeded Otto III and pursued a more interventionist policy towards Slavic territories. Henry's support for Jaromir's restoration came at the price of increased imperial oversight over Bohemian affairs, including the installation of German advisors in key administrative positions and requirements for military service in imperial campaigns. These conditions represented a significant reduction in the autonomy that earlier Premyslid rulers had enjoyed, but they also provided security guarantees that enabled internal reconstruction after years of civil conflict. Jaromir's reign from 1004 to 1012 focused primarily on rebuilding institutions damaged during the succession crisis and Polish occupation. The restoration of ecclesiastical authority required particular attention, as many churches had been damaged during military campaigns, while clerical personnel had fled to safer territories. The Bishop of Prague, Tietmar, worked closely with ducal authorities to re-establish parish networks and restore monastic communities that had been disrupted by warfare. New churches were constructed to replace those destroyed during the conflicts, often incorporating architectural innovations that reflected increased contact with German building traditions. The economic recovery that characterized Jaromir's reign benefited from renewed access to international trade networks that had been disrupted during the political upheavals. Bohemian merchants re-established commercial relationships with partners in Bavaria, Austria, and northern Italy, while new trading connections developed with emerging commercial centres along the Baltic coast. The restoration of trade relationships generated customs revenues that funded military reconstruction and administrative expansion, enabling the gradual restoration of Bohemian authority over territories lost during the succession crisis. Military reforms implemented during this period reflected lessons learned from recent defeats and the need to compete with increasingly sophisticated neighbouring armies. Jaromir expanded the heavy cavalry formations that had proven effective in earlier campaigns, while introducing new infantry tactics borrowed from imperial military manuals. The construction of new fortifications incorporated the latest developments in castle design, including improved gate systems, enhanced living quarters for garrison forces, and specialized storage facilities for military equipment. These improvements enabled more effective territorial control while providing secure bases for future expansion campaigns. The brief reign of Aldridge from 1012 to 1033 marked a decisive shift toward the internal consolidation that would characterize the later Premyslid period. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused primarily on territorial expansion, Aldrich concentrated on strengthening central authority within established Bohemian boundaries. His administrative reforms established more direct ducal control over regional nobles while reducing the autonomy that local strongmen had traditionally enjoyed. These changes generated resistance from established elites, but created the governmental foundations necessary for sustained economic growth and territorial stability. Aldrich's domestic policies reflected a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between economic development and political authority. He established new market towns at strategic locations throughout Bohemia, providing legal protections and tax incentives that attracted merchants and craftsmen from throughout Central Europe. These urban centres served as focal points for regional economic activity, while generating revenues that reduced ducal dependence on traditional tribute payments from rural populations. The growth of urban commerce also created new social groups whose prosperity depended on continued political stability, providing the Duke with reliable support against noble opposition. The reign of Bretislav, first from 1034 to 1055, represented the culmination of early 11th century Bohemian development and established the foundations for the kingdom's subsequent Golden Age. Bretislav's early campaigns demonstrated renewed Bohemian military capabilities, while his later domestic reforms created the institutional structures that would support sustained territorial expansion and economic growth. His invasion of Poland in 1039 reclaimed territories lost during the previous generation, while extending Bohemian influence into new regions that had never previously acknowledged Premyslid authority. The Polish campaign of 1039 to 1040 revealed the extent of Bohemian military recovery since the disasters of the early 11th century. Bretislav's forces captured major Polish strongholds, including Poznan and Gniezno, while his cavalry units penetrated deep into Polish territory to conduct systematic raids against enemy resources. The campaign's success demonstrated effective coordination between different military units and sophisticated logistical planning that enabled sustained operations far from Bohemian territory. Archaeological evidence from captured Polish fortifications reveals extensive damage from siege operations, indicating the development of advanced military engineering capabilities. The most dramatic achievement of the Polish campaign was the capture of Gniezno, Poland's ecclesiastical capital, where Bretislav's forces seized the remains of St. Adalbert and other religious relics that had become symbols of Polish Christian identity. The translation of these relics to Prague represented both a religious triumph and a political statement regarding Bohemian claims to leadership among Slavic Christian peoples. The arrival of St. Adalbert's remains in Prague was celebrated with elaborate ceremonies that emphasized Bohemian piety, while demonstrating the kingdom's growing ecclesiastical importance. Emperor Henry III's intervention in 1041 forced Bretislav to abandon his Polish conquests, but the campaign's success had already achieved its primary objectives of demonstrating Bohemian military capabilities and securing valuable territorial concessions. The peace settlement negotiated at Regensburg established new boundaries that incorporated significant territorial gains while providing compensation for abandoned claims in other regions. These agreements also confirmed Bohemian autonomy in internal affairs while establishing clear obligations for imperial military service that would characterize subsequent imperial Bohemian relations. The domestic reforms implemented during Bretislav's later reign created the administrative and legal foundations that would support Bohemia's transformation into a major European power. The Statutes of Bretislav, promulgated around 1039, established comprehensive legal codes that regulated marriage practices, inheritance procedures, and commercial relationships according to Christian principles while incorporating traditional Slavic customs. These laws provided legal uniformity throughout Bohemian territories while establishing clear procedures for resolving disputes that had previously generated conflicts between different regional traditions. The ecclesiastical provisions of Bretislav's legislation demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between religious authority and political control. The statutes required regular church attendance, regulated clerical behaviour, and established procedures for founding new parishes that ensured adequate religious services for expanding populations. These requirements strengthened Christian institutions while providing the Duke with additional mechanisms for monitoring and controlling local communities. The legislation also regulated monastic establishments, ensuring their economic contributions to ducal revenues while maintaining their spiritual functions. Economic provisions within the legal codes reflected Bretislav's commitment to promoting commercial development and urban growth. The statutes established standardized weights and measures, regulated market operations, and provided legal protections for merchants travelling through Bohemian territory. These measures facilitated long-distance trade while generating increased customs revenues that funded further governmental expansion. The codes also regulated craft production, establishing quality standards and apprenticeship procedures that enhanced the reputation of Bohemian manufactured goods in international markets. The succession of Spytanev, second in 1055, initiated a period of continued internal development, punctuated by renewed territorial expansion and increasing integration with broader European political networks. Spytanev's reign demonstrated the effectiveness of his father's institutional reforms while revealing new challenges posed by changing international circumstances. The growing power of Hungary under Andrew I and Bela I created new competitive pressures along Bohemia's southern frontiers, while imperial political changes under Henry IV generated opportunities for increased Bohemian autonomy within the imperial system. The Hungarian conflicts that characterized Spytanev's reign reflected broader competition for influence over the emerging kingdoms of Central Europe. Both Bohemia and Hungary sought to establish hegemony over Slavic territories in present-day Slovakia and southern Poland, leading to a series of military campaigns that demonstrated the military sophistication achieved by both powers. Archaeological evidence from contested border regions reveals extensive fortification construction during this period, with both sides establishing networks of castles designed to control strategic river valleys and mountain passes. Military encounters between Bohemian and Hungarian forces showcased the evolution of Central European warfare from its early medieval origins. Both armies employed sophisticated combined arms tactics that integrated heavy cavalry, infantry formations, and specialized siege units capable of reducing fortified positions. The development of castle siege techniques required advanced engineering knowledge and specialized equipment, leading to the recruitment of foreign military experts and the establishment of workshops capable of producing complex siege machinery. The death of Spytanev II in 1061 brought his brother Vratislaus II to power during a period of unprecedented opportunity for Bohemian territorial and political advancement. The imperial crisis generated by Henry IV's conflicts with Pope Gregory VII created circumstances that enabled ambitious regional rulers to expand their authority while extracting concessions from an embattled emperor. Vratislaus exploited these opportunities with remarkable skill, providing crucial military support to Henry during the investiture controversy, while securing recognition of enhanced Bohemian status within the imperial hierarchy. Vratislaus's participation in Henry's Italian campaigns demonstrated Bohemian military capabilities on a European stage while generating significant political and economic benefits. Bohemian forces played crucial roles in several major battles, including the Siege of Rome in 1084, where their engineering expertise proved decisive in breaching the city's ancient fortifications. The success of these campaigns provided Wenceslas with substantial booty that he distributed among his followers, while establishing his reputation as one of the empire's most reliable military commanders. The culmination of Wenceslas's imperial service came in 1085, when Henry IV elevated him to royal status, making him the first king of Bohemia and establishing the precedent for Bohemian royal dignity that would characterize subsequent centuries. The coronation ceremony at Mainz Cathedral represented a watershed moment in Central European political development, recognizing Bohemia's evolution from a peripheral duchy into a major European kingdom. The royal crown, crafted by imperial goldsmiths according to contemporary Byzantine and Western models, incorporated precious stones and religious symbols that emphasized both temporal authority and Christian legitimacy. The transformation from duchy to kingdom involved more than ceremonial recognition, requiring substantial administrative and institutional changes that reflected Bohemia's enhanced political status. Wenceslas established a royal court that rivaled those of other European monarchs, attracting scholars, artists, and administrators from throughout the continent. The court's cultural activities included the patronage of manuscript illumination, architectural projects, and musical composition that enhanced Bohemia's reputation as a centre of Christian learning and artistic achievement. The economic foundations of royal authority required systematic development of resources that could support the expanded governmental apparatus and military obligations associated with royal status. Wenceslas initiated a major expansion of silver mining operations in the Bohemian mountains, employing advanced extraction techniques borrowed from German mining experts, while maintaining Bohemian control over production and distribution. The increased availability of silver enabled more sophisticated monetary systems, while providing resources for architectural projects and military equipment that befitted royal dignity. The development of Prague as a major Central European commercial centre accelerated dramatically during Wenceslas's reign, transforming the city from a regional administrative centre into an international trading hub that attracted merchants from throughout Europe. The construction of new market facilities, improved harbour installations along the Vltava River, and expanded storage warehouses created infrastructure capable of handling increased commercial traffic. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive construction activity during this period, including the expansion of craft workshops and residential areas that accommodated growing urban populations. The establishment of new trade routes connecting Prague with distant markets generated substantial customs revenues while introducing new goods and technologies that enhanced Bohemian economic development. Merchants travelling these routes carried luxury goods from Byzantine territories, amber from Baltic regions, and manufactured products from Italian cities, creating commercial networks that link Bohemia with markets throughout Europe and beyond. The regulation of these trade relationships required sophisticated legal and administrative systems that demonstrated the kingdom's governmental maturity. Religious architecture flourished under royal patronage as Wenceslas commissioned major construction projects that demonstrated both pious devotion and royal magnificence. The reconstruction of Prague Castle's Church of St. Vitus incorporated architectural innovations borrowed from contemporary German and Italian examples, while maintaining distinctively Bohemian decorative elements. The church's expanded choir, elaborate altar installations, and sophisticated sculptural programs created a religious setting appropriate for royal ceremonies, while providing adequate space for the growing number of pilgrims visiting St. Wenceslas's shrine. The foundation of new monasteries throughout Bohemian territories reflected both religious commitment and practical administrative considerations. Brevanov Abbey, originally established during the 10th century, received substantial new endowments that enabled major expansion of its buildings and economic activities. The monastery's scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts that combined traditional Slavonic religious texts with contemporary Latin theological works, creating a distinctive artistic tradition that influenced manuscript production throughout Central Europe. Archaeological investigations at Brevnov have revealed extensive construction projects from this period, including new residential quarters, expanded workshops, and sophisticated water management systems. Sazava Monastery represented a particularly significant development in Bohemian religious life, maintaining Slavonic liturgical traditions that connected Bohemian Christianity with its Byzantine origins while operating within the Roman ecclesiastical structure. The monastery's unique position enabled it to serve as a bridge between Eastern and Western Christian traditions, producing religious texts in both Slavonic and Latin scripts while maintaining theological positions acceptable to Roman authorities. The monastery's library preserved important early Slavonic texts that might otherwise have been lost during the period's religious and political upheavals. The death of Wenceslas II in 1092 initiated a prolonged period of dynastic instability that would paradoxically strengthen the institutional foundations of Bohemian royal authority while creating the preconditions for unprecedented territorial expansion under later rulers. The succession disputes that characterized the late 11th and early 12th centuries forced competing Premyslid claimants to develop more sophisticated administrative systems and military organizations in their struggles for supremacy, innovations that would prove crucial during the great expansion of the 13th century. The eventual consolidation of royal authority under Ottokar, first in the early 1200s, provided the stable platform from which his successors would launch the most ambitious territorial campaigns in Bohemian history. The complex succession arrangements established by Wenceslas II, which divided territories among his sons while maintaining theoretical unity under senior authority, reflected contemporary practices throughout Central Europe, but created inherent instabilities that would plague Bohemian politics for generations. Conrad I, who inherited the royal title, controlled Prague and its immediate surroundings, while his brothers Bretislav II and Borovoy II received substantial duchies that maintained significant autonomy. This fragmentation of authority occurred precisely when external pressures from Hungarian expansion and Polish recovery demanded unified responses, creating strategic vulnerabilities that neighbouring powers attempted to exploit. The Hungarian campaigns of the 1090s revealed both the military capabilities that Bohemia had developed under royal authority and the weaknesses created by internal political divisions. Hungarian forces under Koloman the Learned penetrated deep into Moravian territories, capturing fortified positions that had been constructed during the previous century's expansion. The Hungarian success reflected not only their military competence, but also their ability to exploit divisions between different Premyslid factions, some of whom preferred accommodation with Hungarian power to submission to Prague's authority. Archaeological evidence from contested border regions shows extensive destruction during this period, with many fortifications abandoned or substantially modified to meet changing military requirements. The gradual restoration of unified Bohemian authority during the reigns of Bretislav II and Borovoy II required careful balance between accommodation of regional autonomy and assertion of central control. Both rulers implemented administrative reforms that strengthened royal authority while respecting traditional noble privileges, creating governmental structures that could function effectively despite ongoing political tensions. The development of written administrative records during this period, preserved in monastic archives and castle repositories, demonstrates increasing bureaucratic sophistication that enabled more effective territorial control and resource mobilization. Economic development continued despite political instability, driven by expanding trade relationships and technological innovations that enhanced agricultural productivity and craft production. The introduction of new mining techniques, borrowed from German experts working in the Harz Mountains, enabled more efficient extraction of silver from Bohemian deposits while reducing production costs. These technological improvements generated increased revenues that funded military reconstruction and administrative expansion, providing the resources necessary for renewed territorial ambitions. the establishment of new market towns throughout Bohemian territories created commercial networks that linked rural producers with the distant markets while generating customs revenues for royal coffers. The succession of Vladislaus II in 1140 marked the beginning of renewed territorial expansion and the restoration of Bohemian influence in Central European politics. Vladislaus's early campaigns against Hungarian positions in Slovakia demonstrated the military recovery that had occurred during the previous decades, while establishing his credentials as an effective military commander. His forces employed sophisticated siege techniques that enabled the capture of strongly fortified positions, including the use of counterweight trebuchets and specialized undermining equipment that reflected contemporary advances in military engineering. The Second Crusade of 1147 provided Vladislaus with opportunities to demonstrate Bohemian military capabilities on an international stage while securing papal recognition of his territorial claims. Bohemian contingents participated in the Siege of Damascus, where their engineering expertise proved valuable in constructing siege works capable of threatening the city's formidable fortifications. Although the crusade ultimately failed to achieve its objectives, Bohemian participation enhanced the kingdom's international reputation while establishing diplomatic relationships that would prove valuable in subsequent territorial disputes. Vladislaus's involvement in the imperial civil wars that followed Conrad III's death in 1152 reflected sophisticated understanding of the opportunities created by imperial weakness for territorial expansion by regional powers. His support for Frederick Barbarossa's imperial candidacy provided crucial military assistance during the decisive campaigns while securing imperial recognition of enhanced Bohemian autonomy. The resulting agreements established Bohemia's position as one of the empire's most important constituent kingdoms, while confirming royal prerogatives that had been disputed during previous reigns. The elevation of Bohemia to the status of hereditary kingdom, confirmed by Frederick Barbarossa in 1158, represented the culmination of centuries of political development and established the legal foundations for subsequent territorial expansion. Unlike the personal royal dignity granted to Vratislaus II, which had expired with his death, the new arrangement established permanent royal status for Bohemian rulers while reducing imperial interference in succession disputes. This enhanced autonomy provided Bohemian kings with greater freedom to pursue territorial ambitions without requiring imperial approval for each expansion campaign. The reign of Frederick, Vladislaus's son, from 1178 to 1189, demonstrated the military and administrative capabilities that hereditary royal status had made possible while revealing the continuing challenges posed by noble opposition to centralized authority. Frederick's campaigns against Austrian positions along the Danube River extended Bohemian influence into territories that had previously remained outside Premyslid control, while his domestic policies strengthened royal authority through administrative reforms and military innovations. The construction of new royal castles at strategic locations throughout Bohemia provided secure bases for royal administration, while demonstrating the architectural sophistication that characterized late 12th century Bohemian building projects. The succession crisis that followed Frederick's death in 1189 created opportunities for external intervention that threatened to reverse the territorial gains achieved during previous decades. Conrad Otto of Znojmo, who claimed the throne based on his position as senior male member of the Premyslid dynasty, received support from Austrian and Hungarian forces that sought to establish client rulers who would accommodate their territorial ambitions. The resulting conflicts devastated large areas of Bohemia and Moravia, while demonstrating the continuing importance of external support in Bohemian succession disputes. The eventual triumph of Ottokar, first in 1197, initiated the most successful period of territorial expansion in Bohemian history, while establishing the administrative and military foundations that would support sustained imperial ambitions. Ottokar's early reign focused on internal consolidation and the restoration of royal authority that had been weakened during the succession conflicts, implementing administrative reforms that strengthened central government while accommodating regional noble interests. His military reforms created professional forces capable of sustained campaign operations, while his diplomatic initiatives established alliance networks that would prove crucial during subsequent expansion campaigns. The Golden Bull of Sicily, issued by Frederick II in 1212, represented the most significant constitutional development in Bohemian history and established the legal framework that would govern the kingdom's relationship with the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. The bull confirmed Bohemia's status as a hereditary kingdom, while substantially reducing imperial interference in internal Bohemian affairs, including succession disputes, ecclesiastical appointments, and territorial administration. These provisions reflected both imperial recognition of Bohemian importance within the imperial system and Frederick's need for reliable allies during his conflicts with papal authority and Italian city-states. The constitutional arrangements established by the Golden Bull created unprecedented opportunities for independent Bohemian action in territorial expansion and diplomatic relationships. Unlike previous agreements that had required imperial approval for major policy initiatives, the new framework enabled Bohemian kings to pursue territorial ambitions based on their own strategic calculations rather than imperial preferences. This enhanced autonomy would prove crucial during the Great Expansion campaigns of the mid-13th century, when Bohemian forces operated far from imperial territories and often in opposition to imperial interests. The domestic implications of the Golden Bull extended far beyond constitutional relationships with the empire to encompass fundamental changes in internal Bohemian governance and social organisation. The confirmation of hereditary royal status eliminated the succession uncertainties that had plagued previous centuries, while establishing clear procedures for royal succession that reduced opportunities for external interference. These arrangements strengthened royal authority while providing nobles with greater security regarding their own territorial holdings and hereditary rights. Economic provisions within the Golden Bull facilitated the commercial development that would provide resources for territorial expansion, while establishing Bohemia's position as a major Central European trading power. The bull confirmed royal control over mining operations, customs collection, and monetary policy, while reducing imperial taxation that had previously limited Bohemian economic development. These arrangements enabled more systematic development of silver mining operations that would generate the revenues necessary for sustained military campaigns and territorial administration. The reign of Wenceslas, first from 1230 to 1253, established the military and administrative foundations that would enable his son Ottokar II to achieve unprecedented territorial expansion while demonstrating Bohemian capabilities in sustained campaign operations against sophisticated opponents. Wenceslas's early campaigns against Austrian positions along the Danube River employed innovative siege techniques and cavalry tactics that reflected the military developments achieved during his father's reign. His forces successfully captured several major Austrian strongholds, including fortifications that had previously been considered impregnable, demonstrating the effectiveness of Bohemian military engineering and the quality of their professional forces. The Austrian campaigns revealed the strategic importance of controlling river valleys and mountain passes for sustained territorial expansion in Central Europe. Wenceslas's forces established fortified positions at crucial geographic choke points that enabled them to control trade routes while preventing enemy forces from coordinating effective responses to Bohemian expansion. The construction of new castles at these strategic locations employed the latest developments in military architecture, including concentric defensive systems, specialized artillery positions, and sophisticated water management systems that enabled extended siege resistance. Military innovations developed during Wenceslas's reign included the systematic use of crossbow units that provided Bohemian forces with significant advantages in siege warfare and defensive operations. Bohemian crossbowmen employed steel-reinforced weapons capable of penetrating the heaviest contemporary armour while maintaining accuracy at ranges that exceeded traditional archery capabilities. The training and equipment of these specialised units required substantial financial investment and technical expertise, demonstrating the kingdom's commitment to maintaining military superiority over regional competitors. The succession of Ottokar II in 1253 initiated the most ambitious period of territorial expansion in Central European history, as the young king pursued imperial ambitions that would briefly create a Bohemian empire stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Adriatic coast. Ottokar's early campaigns demonstrated the military capabilities that his predecessors had developed, while revealing his own exceptional talents as a military commander and political strategist. His systematic approach to territorial expansion combined military conquest with diplomatic negotiation and dynastic marriage in ways that maximised Bohemian gains, while minimising the risks associated with simultaneous conflicts on multiple frontiers. The acquisition of Austria in 1251, achieved through Ottokar's marriage to Margaret of Babenberg following the extinction of the Babenberg dynasty, provided Bohemia with control over crucial Danube River territories while substantially increasing the kingdom's economic and military resources. Austrian territories included some of the most productive agricultural lands in Central Europe, extensive silver mining operations, and strategic commercial centres that generated substantial customs revenues. The integration of Austrian administrative systems with existing Bohemian governmental structures required sophisticated organisational capabilities that demonstrated the kingdom's bureaucratic maturity. The expansion into Styria during the 1250s extended Bohemian control southward toward the Adriatic, while providing access to iron mining operations that enhanced the kingdom's military production capabilities. Styrian territories included mountain passes that controlled access to Italian markets, enabling Bohemia to influence commercial relationships between northern and southern Europe. The military campaigns required to secure Styrian territories demonstrated Bohemian capabilities in alpine warfare, including specialised equipment and tactics adapted to mountainous terrain conditions. Corinthian territories acquired during the early 1260s provided Bohemia with direct access to Italian trade routes, while establishing the kingdom's position as a major Central European power capable of influencing imperial politics in Italy. The administrative integration of Corinthian territories required the establishment of new governmental systems that could accommodate local legal traditions while ensuring loyalty to Bohemian royal authority. Archaeological evidence from major Corinthian towns reveals extensive construction projects undertaken during the Bohemian period, including fortification improvements, market facilities, and religious buildings that demonstrated the kingdom's commitment to long-term territorial control. The acquisition of Carniolan territories completed Ottokar's creation of a territorial corridor, connecting Bohemian heartlands with the Adriatic coast, while providing control over alpine passes that had previously remained outside Bohemian influence. These territories included important commercial centres, where Italian merchants exchanged goods with traders from northern Europe, generating customs revenues that funded further territorial expansion. The strategic importance of Carniolan positions became evident during subsequent conflicts when control of these territories enabled or prevented effective coordination between different theatres of military operations. Military campaigns that achieved these territorial acquisitions demonstrated the sophistication of Bohemian military organisation and the effectiveness of combined arms tactics that integrated heavy cavalry, infantry formations, siege specialists, and support units capable of sustained operations in diverse geographic conditions. Bohemian forces employed standardised equipment and training procedures that enabled effective coordination between units drawn from different territorial regions while maintaining the flexibility necessary for the adaptation to local tactical requirements. The logistical systems developed to support these campaigns included specialized transport units, field hospitals, and supply trains that enabled sustained operations far from Bohemian-based territories. Diplomatic marriages arranged to consolidate territorial gains reflected Ottokar's sophisticated understanding of dynastic politics and his ability to balance competing claims in ways that maximize Bohemian advantages. His marriage to Kunigunde of Slavonia strengthened Bohemian influence in southeastern Europe, while his daughter's marriage to Hungarian nobility established alliance relationships that neutralized potential Hungarian opposition to Bohemian expansion. These diplomatic arrangements created a network of relationships that extended Bohemian influence far beyond territories under direct royal control, while providing early warning systems regarding potential threats to Bohemian interests. The brief creation of a Central European empire under Bohemian leadership represented one of the most remarkable achievements in medieval political history, demonstrating the capabilities that systematic territorial expansion and administrative development could create when directed by exceptional leadership. At its zenith around 1270, Ottokar's territories included not only traditional Bohemian and Moravian lands, but also Austria, Styria, Carinthia, Carniola, and portions of present-day Slovenia, creating a political entity that rivaled the territorial extent of the Carolingian Empire at its peak. The administrative challenges posed by governing such diverse territories required innovations in governmental organisation that influenced political development throughout Central Europe. The economic integration of expanded territories generated unprecedented revenues that funded further military expansion, while supporting cultural and architectural projects that enhanced Bohemia's international reputation. Silver production from mines in Bohemian, Austrian, and Styrian territories provided the monetary resources necessary for maintaining professional military forces, while the agricultural surplus from fertile Danubian regions supported urban populations engaged in craft production and commercial activities. Trade revenues from customs collection at strategic commercial centres enabled systematic investment in infrastructure projects that improved transportation networks and communication systems throughout the expanded kingdom. The cultural achievements that characterised Ottokar's reign reflected both the resources made available through territorial expansion and the international contacts that resulted from governing diverse populations with different linguistic and religious traditions. Prague became a major centre of Gothic architecture as royal patronage funded construction projects that employed master craftsmen from throughout Europe while incorporating local artistic traditions. The royal court attracted scholars, artists, and administrators from distant regions, creating a cosmopolitan environment that fostered intellectual exchange and cultural innovation. The growing conflict with Rudolf of Habsburg reflected both the inevitable opposition that Bohemian expansion would generate from established imperial authorities and the specific challenges posed by Rudolf's election as Holy Roman Emperor in 1273. Rudolf's candidacy had been supported by princes who opposed Ottokar's territorial ambitions and sought to restore imperial authority over territories that had been acquired by Bohemian expansion. The resulting confrontation would test whether Bohemian military capabilities and alliance networks could sustain the territorial empire that Ottokar had created against the combined opposition of imperial forces and regional enemies. Rudolf's systematic campaign to isolate Bohemia diplomatically preceded the military confrontation that would ultimately determine the fate of Ottokar's territorial empire. The new emperor negotiated agreements with Hungarian and Polish rulers that promised territorial concessions in exchange for military support against Bohemian positions, while offering Austrian and Styrian nobles guarantees regarding their traditional privileges under Habsburg rather than Bohemian authority. These diplomatic initiatives created the alliance networks that would prove decisive during the subsequent military campaigns. while demonstrating Rudolf's understanding of the political dynamics that had enabled Bohemian expansion. The Battle of Marchfeld on August 26, 1278, represented the culmination of years of diplomatic manoeuvring and military preparation as the largest armies assembled in Central Europe since the Magyar invasions met on the plains east of Vienna. Ottokar's forces included contingents from throughout his territorial empire, with Bohemian heavy cavalry forming the core of his battle line, supported by Austrian infantry, Styrian crossbowmen, and allied units from various subject territories. The army's diversity reflected both the multinational character of Ottokar's empire and the military resources that territorial expansion had made available for this decisive confrontation. Rudolf's army combined imperial forces with contingents provided by Hungarian allies under Ladislaus IV, whose cavalry units employed traditional Magyar tactics that had proven effective against Western European heavy cavalry in previous conflicts. The imperial forces included experienced German knights who had participated in multiple Italian campaigns, while Hungarian contingents brought expertise in steppe warfare tactics that differed substantially from the conventional Western European military practices that characterized most contemporary armies. Archaeological investigations at the battlefield site have revealed weapon fragments and equipment remains that demonstrate the scale and intensity of the combat that determined Central Europe's political future. The battle's outcome resulted from tactical decisions made during the height of combat rather than fundamental disparities in military capabilities or numerical strength between the opposing forces. Ottokar's initial cavalry charge achieved significant success against imperial positions, breaking through the first line of defence and threatening to collapse Rudolf's entire battle formation. However, the Hungarian cavalry's flanking manoeuvre, coordinated with a renewed imperial assault on Bohemian positions, created tactical circumstances that Ottokar's forces could not overcome despite their individual courage and military competence. Ottokar's death during the final stages of combat eliminated the leadership that had created and sustained Bohemian territorial expansion, while creating succession circumstances that prevented effective resistance to the territorial losses that would follow. The king's body, discovered among the casualties after the battle's conclusion, bore wounds that indicated he had fought personally in the final cavalry melees, rather than attempting to preserve his life for continued resistance. His death symbolized both the personal courage that had characterized his military leadership and the end of Bohemian imperial ambitions that had briefly transformed Central European political relationships. The immediate aftermath of Marchfeld witnessed the rapid collapse of Bohemian territorial expansion as subject territories returned to their previous allegiances, while Bohemian forces withdrew to defensive positions within traditional kingdom boundaries. Austrian and Styrian territories acknowledged Habsburg authority, while Carinthian and Carniolan regions accepted imperial administration that restored their previous constitutional arrangements. The speed of this territorial collapse reflected both the personal nature of medieval political relationships and the limited institutional development that had characterized Ottokar's rapid expansion. The territorial losses that followed Ottokar II's death at Marchfeld created a power vacuum in Central Europe that neighbouring kingdoms rushed to exploit, while the Premyslid dynasty struggled to maintain control over even their traditional Bohemian heartlands. The regency established for the young Wenceslas II proved incapable of preventing Hungarian incursions into Moravian territories or Austrian expansion into border regions that had previously acknowledged Bohemian authority. Internal noble factions, emboldened by royal weakness, began asserting greater autonomy while some openly negotiated with foreign powers regarding alternative political arrangements that would better serve their territorial interests. The assassination of Wenceslas III in 1306 eliminated the last male heir of the Premyslid dynasty and precipitated a succession crisis that would fundamentally transform Bohemian political structures. The extinction of the ancient royal line that had governed Bohemia for over 4 centuries created unprecedented constitutional circumstances, as no clear legal precedents existed for selecting new rulers from outside the established dynastic framework. Various claimants emerged, each supported by different noble factions and foreign powers who saw opportunities to advance their own territorial ambitions through the installation of compliant rulers. Rudolf of Austria, representing Habsburg interests, claimed the Bohemian throne based on his marriage to Wenceslas II's widow and his family's previous territorial holdings in the region. His candidacy received support from nobles in southern Bohemia who had maintained commercial relationships with Austrian territories and preferred accommodation with Habsburg power to the uncertainties associated with more distant claimants. Archaeological evidence from castles controlled by pro-Habsburg nobles reveals extensive fortification improvements during this period, suggesting preparation for sustained military resistance against alternative claimants. Henry of Carinthia presented competing claims based on his marriage to Anne of Bohemia, daughter of Wenceslas II, and his previous administrative experience in territories that had formally acknowledged Bohemian authority. His supporters included nobles from northern Bohemia who had opposed Habsburg expansion and preferred alliance with German princes who could provide military assistance against Austrian encroachment. Henry's brief reign from 1307 to 1310 demonstrated both the military capabilities that foreign claimants could mobilize and the fundamental weaknesses created by dependence on external support for internal legitimacy. The Bohemian nobility's decision to offer the crown to John of Luxembourg in 1310 reflected sophisticated calculations regarding the kingdom's strategic position within the broader European political system rather than mere opportunistic alliance-seeking. John's candidacy combined several attractive elements. His youth suggested potential for long-term dynastic stability. His family's territorial holdings in the Low Countries provided access to wealthy commercial regions, and his father Henry VII's recent election as Holy Roman Emperor offered prospects for imperial support without the direct subordination that Habsburg rule would have entailed. The marriage negotiations between John and Elizabeth of Bohemia, the last surviving child of Wenceslas II, required careful attention to constitutional precedents and legal traditions that would legitimize the new dynasty's authority while preserving established noble privileges. The marriage contracts negotiated in 1310 established Elizabeth's rights as queen regnant while confirming John's authority as king consort, creating a unique constitutional arrangement that balanced dynastic legitimacy with practical governmental needs. These arrangements reflected the sophisticated legal scholarship that had developed within Bohemian ecclesiastical and noble circles during previous centuries of political complexity. John's coronation in Prague in August 1310 marked the beginning of Luxembourg rule in Bohemia and initiated a period of unprecedented international engagement that would transform the kingdom's role within European politics. The ceremony itself demonstrated the new dynasty's commitment to maintaining Bohemian traditions while introducing elements that reflected their broader European connections. The crown used in the coronation incorporated gems and precious metals from Luxembourg territories, while maintaining the basic design elements that had characterized previous Premyslid coronations, symbolizing both continuity and change in royal authority. The early years of John's reign revealed both his exceptional military talents and his fundamental misunderstanding of Bohemian political traditions and economic requirements. His immediate departure for military campaigns in Italy left governmental administration in the hands of appointed regents who lacked the personal relationships with noble families that had traditionally facilitated effective royal authority. These administrative arrangements generated resentment among nobles who expected direct access to royal decision-making, while creating opportunities for corruption and mismanagement that weakened the kingdom's financial resources. John's Italian campaigns demonstrated the military capabilities that would make him one of Europe's most celebrated knights, while revealing the costs associated with sustained military operations in distant territories. His forces participated in the complex conflicts between papal authority and imperial claims in northern Italy, where Bohemian heavy cavalry proved particularly effective in the siege warfare that characterized most military operations. The campaigns provided John with valuable combat experience and international recognition, while generating substantial costs that strained Bohemian financial resources and created domestic political tensions. The Siege of Brescia in 1311 showcased both John's personal courage and the tactical innovations that Bohemian forces had developed during their Italian service. Bohemian engineers constructed sophisticated siege works that employed counterweight trebuchets and specialized undermining techniques to breach the city's formidable fortifications. The successful capture of Brescia after a prolonged siege demonstrated Bohemian military competence, while providing substantial booty that partially offset campaign expenses. Archaeological investigations at Brescia have revealed evidence of the siege works, including stone projectiles and metal fragments from Bohemian siege engines. The Bohemian involvement in imperial politics intensified following Henry VII's death in 1313 and John's subsequent support for his brother-in-law Charles IV of France during the complex succession disputes that followed. These diplomatic commitments required substantial military contributions that further strained Bohemian resources while providing limited direct benefits to the kingdom's territorial or commercial interests. John's forces participated in several major battles in France and the Low Countries, where their military reputation enhanced Luxembourg prestige while creating financial obligations that would plague Bohemian administration for decades. The domestic opposition that emerged during John's frequent absences reflected both specific grievances regarding taxation and military service and broader concerns about the kingdom's strategic direction under foreign dynastic rule. Noble assemblies began asserting greater authority over royal policy decisions, particularly regarding military commitments that required substantial financial contributions from Bohemian territories. These constitutional developments established precedents for noble participation in governmental decision-making that would influence Bohemian political development throughout the Luxembourg period. The rebellion led by Henry of Lippe in 1315 represented the most serious challenge to John's authority and revealed the extent of noble dissatisfaction with Luxembourg rule. Henry's forces controlled substantial territories in northern Bohemia while maintaining diplomatic relationships with Polish and Hungarian rulers who provided military assistance in exchange for territorial concessions. The rebellion's initial success demonstrated both the military capabilities that discontented nobles could mobilize and the weakness of royal authority when the king remained absent from the kingdom for extended periods. John's return to Bohemia in 1316 to address the rebellion showcased his military talents in domestic contexts, while revealing his capacity for political compromise when circumstances required accommodation rather than confrontation. His forces employed sophisticated siege techniques to reduce rebel strongholds, while his diplomatic initiatives offered amnesty and compensation to nobles who abandoned the rebellion. The successful resolution of the crisis strengthened royal authority, while establishing precedents for noble participation in governmental administration that would characterize subsequent Luxembourg rule. The economic policies implemented following the rebellion's suppression reflected John's recognition of the need to balance international military commitments with domestic resource requirements. New taxation systems were established that provided more predictable revenues while reducing the arbitrary levies that had generated noble opposition. These fiscal reforms included standardized assessment procedures and regular collection schedules that improved governmental efficiency, while providing nobles with greater certainty regarding their financial obligations. The reforms also established new commercial regulations that enhanced trade revenues while protecting merchant interests that had suffered during the political instability. The expansion of silver mining operations during the 1320s provided John with the financial resources necessary to pursue renewed military campaigns while maintaining domestic political stability. New extraction techniques borrowed from German mining experts enabled more efficient exploitation of Bohemian silver deposits while reducing production costs. The increased silver production generated substantial revenues that funded both military expeditions and domestic infrastructure projects, creating economic conditions that supported continued Luxembourg rule, despite ongoing concerns about the dynasty's international commitments. John's participation in the crusading movement reflected both his personal religious convictions and his strategic understanding of the diplomatic advantages that crusading service could provide for ambitious rulers seeking to enhance their international reputations. His involvement in the Prussian Crusades during the 1320s brought Bohemian forces into contact with the Teutonic Knights, while providing opportunities for territorial expansion in regions that had previously remained outside Central European political influence. These campaigns demonstrated Bohemian military capabilities in Baltic conditions, while establishing diplomatic relationships that would prove valuable during subsequent conflicts. The Lithuanian campaigns that occupied much of John's attention during the 1330s represented some of the most challenging military operations undertaken by medieval Bohemian forces, requiring adaptation to forest warfare conditions and enemy tactics that differed substantially from conventional Western European military practices. Bohemian forces employed specialized equipment, including portable bridges for river crossings and modified siege engines adapted to woodland conditions. The campaigns achieved limited territorial gains while providing valuable military experience that enhanced Bohemian capabilities in unconventional warfare situations. The growing tensions with France during the 1330s created diplomatic complications that would ultimately lead to John's death at Crécy, while demonstrating the complex international relationships that Luxembourg rule had created for Bohemia. John's alliance obligations to France required military service against English forces during the opening phases of what would become the 100 Years' War, commitments that placed Bohemian forces in conflicts that had little direct relevance to the kingdom's strategic interests. These military obligations reflected both the advantages and disadvantages of the international connections that Luxembourg dynastic rule had established. The Battle of Crécy on August 26, 1346, represented both the culmination of John's military career and the tragic consequences of chivalric idealism when confronted with innovative military technologies and tactics. Despite being nearly blind from previous injuries sustained during his numerous military campaigns, John insisted on participating personally in the cavalry charges against English positions. His decision to fight despite his physical limitations reflected both personal courage and adherence to chivalric codes that valued honour above practical considerations of military effectiveness or dynastic continuity. The English longbowmen at Crécy employed tactical innovations that proved devastatingly effective against traditional heavy cavalry charges, creating circumstances where individual courage and martial skill provided little advantage against massed archery fire. John's forces, fighting alongside French knights, encountered withering volleys of arrows that decimated their ranks before they could engage in close combat, where their superior armour and weapons would have provided advantages. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield includes numerous arrowheads and armour fragments that demonstrate the intensity of the archery bombardment that determined the battle's outcome. John's death during the final cavalry charges eliminated one of Europe's most experienced military commanders, while creating succession circumstances that would enable his son Charles to transform Bohemia into the political and cultural centre of Central Europe. The discovery of John's body among the fallen, identified by the distinctive Luxembourg heraldry on his surcoat, confirmed both his personal participation in the combat and his adherence to chivalric principles that prioritised honour over survival. His death symbolised both the end of an era of Bohemian military adventurism and the beginning of a period focused on internal development and imperial ambitions. The immediate succession of Charles IV to the Bohemian throne in 1346 coincided with his election as Holy Roman Emperor, creating unprecedented opportunities for Bohemian influence within the imperial system while establishing Prague as a major centre of European politics. Charles's educational background, which included extensive study in Paris and administrative experience in Italy, provided him with sophisticated understanding of contemporary governmental practices and diplomatic relationships that would prove crucial during his transformation of Bohemia into an imperial capital. His multilingual abilities and cultural knowledge enabled effective communication with diverse populations throughout his territories, while facilitating the international relationships necessary for sustained imperial authority. The transfer of the imperial capital from traditional German centres to Prague represented one of the most significant political developments in 14th century Europe, and demonstrated Charles's vision of Bohemia's potential role within the broader imperial system. The decision required substantial investment in architectural projects and administrative infrastructure that would accommodate the governmental apparatus necessary for imperial administration while providing appropriate settings for the ceremonial activities that legitimised imperial authority. Archaeological evidence from Prague Castle reveals extensive construction projects initiated during Charles's early reign, including new residential quarters, administrative buildings, and ceremonial spaces designed to rival the imperial centres of previous centuries. The architectural transformation of Prague under Charles's patronage created one of Europe's most impressive urban centres, while demonstrating the kingdom's cultural sophistication and economic capabilities. The construction of St. Vitus Cathedral, begun in 1344, employed master craftsmen from throughout Europe while incorporating architectural innovations that reflected contemporary developments in Gothic design. The cathedral's elaborate facade, sophisticated structural systems, and extensive sculptural programs created a religious setting appropriate for imperial coronations, while providing adequate space for the growing number of pilgrims visiting Bohemian religious sites. The foundation of Charles University in 1348 established the first university in Central Europe and created an institutional centre for scholarly activity that attracted students and faculty from throughout the continent. The university's curriculum included traditional subjects of theology, law, and medicine, while incorporating newer disciplines that reflected contemporary intellectual developments. The establishment of separate colleges for different linguistic groups enabled effective instruction for the diverse student population, while maintaining academic standards that rivaled those of established universities in Paris and Oxford. The university's library, established through royal patronage and private donations, preserved important manuscripts while supporting scholarly research that enhanced Bohemia's intellectual reputation. The construction of Charles Bridge, begun in 1357, represented both a remarkable engineering achievement and a symbol of Prague's transformation into a major European capital. The bridge's sophisticated design employed advanced construction techniques that enabled it to withstand the Vltava River's seasonal flooding, while providing adequate capacity for the increased commercial traffic that imperial status had generated. The bridge's decorative elements, including elaborate sculptural programs and architectural details, demonstrated the artistic capabilities that royal patronage had fostered, while creating a distinctive urban landmark that enhanced Prague's international reputation. The cultural flowering that characterised Charles's reign attracted artists, scholars, and craftsmen from throughout Europe, while fostering distinctive Bohemian traditions in manuscript illumination, architectural design, and religious art. The royal court became a centre of international cultural exchange, where different artistic traditions merged to create new forms of expression that influenced artistic development throughout Central Europe. The court's patronage of manuscript production resulted in illuminated texts that combined traditional Bohemian decorative elements with contemporary European artistic innovations, creating works that demonstrated both technical excellence and cultural sophistication. The administrative reforms implemented during Charles's reign created governmental structures capable of managing the expanded territories under Bohemian control, while maintaining the efficiency necessary for effective imperial administration. New bureaucratic procedures standardized record-keeping practices while establishing clear hierarchies of authority that enabled effective coordination between different administrative levels. These reforms included the establishment of written legal codes that clarified judicial procedures while protecting traditional noble privileges within the framework of enhanced royal authority. The economic policies that supported Charles's architectural and cultural projects reflected sophisticated understanding of the relationship between commercial development and political authority. New trade agreements with Italian city-states and Flemish commercial centres enhanced Prague's position as a major commercial hub, while generating customs revenues that funded continued construction projects. The regulation of craft production through guild systems ensured quality standards while providing additional tax revenues that supported governmental expansion. These economic developments created urban prosperity that attracted additional population while generating the wealth necessary for sustained cultural patronage. The succession of Wenceslas IV in 1378 coincided with the beginning of the Western Schism and created circumstances that would test both Bohemian governmental institutions and the kingdom's position within the broader European political system. Wenceslas inherited substantial territorial holdings and well-developed administrative systems, but he also faced challenges created by the papal schism, growing religious tensions within Bohemia, and noble opposition to policies that had concentrated authority in royal hands. His reign would reveal both the strengths and weaknesses of the governmental structures that Charles had created while establishing the preconditions for the religious crisis that would dominate early 15th century Bohemian politics. The religious tensions that had been building throughout Wenceslas IV's reign reached a critical juncture with the emergence of Jan Hus as a prominent voice for ecclesiastical reform and Czech national identity. Hus, appointed rector of Prague University in 1409, had absorbed the theological writings of John Wycliffe during his studies and began advocating for fundamental changes in church practices that resonated deeply with both scholarly circles and ordinary Bohemians, frustrated by clerical corruption. His sermons at Bethlehem Chapel, delivered in Czech rather than Latin, attracted audiences that included nobles, burghers, and craftsmen who had grown increasingly resentful of the wealth and moral failings displayed by many church officials. The theological positions that Hus developed during his tenure at Prague University challenged fundamental assumptions about ecclesiastical authority, while appealing to Czech national sentiments that had been fostered by decades of cultural development under Charles IV. His treatises argued that the true church consisted of the predestined faithful rather than the institutional hierarchy, that papal authority derived from moral worthiness rather than apostolic succession, and that scripture should be accessible to ordinary believers in their native language. These ideas struck at the heart of medieval church organisation, while providing intellectual justification for Czech resistance to German ecclesiastical dominance that had characterised Bohemian religious life since the establishment of the Prague bishopric. The Council of Constance, convened in 1414 to resolve the Western Schism and address growing calls for church reform throughout Europe, provided Hus's opponents with an opportunity to eliminate his influence while demonstrating their commitment to ecclesiastical orthodoxy. Emperor Sigismund, who had inherited the Bohemian crown following his brother Wenceslas's death in 1419, issued a safe conduct guarantee that promised Hus protection during his journey to Constance and participation in the council's proceedings. This imperial protection reflected both Sigismund's desire to resolve religious tensions within his territories and his confidence that conciliar authorities would handle the Hus controversy in ways that strengthened rather than weakened established church structures. Huss's arrival in Constance in November 1414 marked the beginning of proceedings that would transform a theological dispute into a catalyst for revolutionary upheaval throughout Central Europe. The safe conduct that Sigismund had provided proved worthless when conciliar authorities arrested Huss shortly after his arrival, arguing that imperial guarantees could not protect heretics from ecclesiastical justice. The arrest violated both imperial authority and diplomatic conventions, while demonstrating the council's determination to eliminate reform movements that threatened established church hierarchy. Archaeological evidence from Constance includes remains of the prison where Huss was held, revealing the harsh conditions that characterized his 8-month incarceration before trial. The trial proceedings that began in June 1415 revealed the fundamental incompatibility between Huss's theological positions and the ecclesiastical orthodoxy that conciliar authorities sought to maintain. The charges against Huss included denial of papal supremacy, advocacy of communion in both kinds for lay believers, and promotion of vernacular religious services that undermined clerical authority. The trial transcripts preserved in conciliar archives demonstrate both the sophisticated theological arguments that Huss presented in his defence and the predetermined nature of proceedings designed to secure his condemnation, rather than engage seriously with reform proposals. Huss's refusal to recant his theological positions during the final trial session on July 6, 1415, sealed his fate while providing Czech reformers with a martyred leader whose death would inspire decades of religious warfare. His final statement to the council affirmed his commitment to scriptural authority over human traditions, while expressing confidence that future generations would vindicate his theological positions. The execution that followed immediately after his condemnation employed the traditional method of burning, with Huss's ashes scattered in the Rhine River to prevent the collection of relics that might inspire continued devotion to his memory. News of Huss's execution reached Prague in late July 1415 and provoked immediate outrage among university scholars, noble supporters, and ordinary citizens who had followed his teachings. The violation of imperial safe conduct guarantees particularly enraged Czech nobles, who viewed Sigismund's failure to protect Huss as both a betrayal of imperial honour and evidence of German contempt for Czech interests. Public demonstrations in Prague included the burning of papal bulls and the destruction of property belonging to clergy who had supported Huss's condemnation, while university masters issued formal protests that condemned both the trial procedures and the execution itself. The religious ferment that followed Huss's death crystallized around the Four Articles of Prague, formulated in 1420 as a comprehensive statement of Czech reform demands that would guide the revolutionary movement throughout the subsequent wars. The first article demanded freedom of preaching throughout Bohemian territories, challenging the church hierarchy's control over religious instruction, while establishing the principle that qualified individuals could interpret Scripture regardless of their ordination status. This provision reflected both Hussite theological convictions and practical recognition that many parish priests lacked the education necessary for effective pastoral care. The second article required communion in both kinds for all believers, eliminating the distinction between clerical and lay communion that had symbolized ecclesiastical hierarchy throughout medieval Christianity. This demand carried profound symbolic significance beyond its theological implications, representing Czech rejection of German religious dominance while asserting the spiritual equality of all believers. Archaeological evidence from Hussite churches reveals the construction of new altar arrangements designed to accommodate communion in both kinds, including expanded sanctuary spaces and specialized vessels for wine distribution to large congregations. The third article called for the elimination of clerical property ownership and temporal authority, arguing that priests should live in apostolic poverty while focusing exclusively on spiritual duties. This provision targeted the extensive landholdings that had made the Bohemian Church one of the kingdom's wealthiest institutions, while addressing popular resentment of clerical involvement in secular politics. The implementation of this article would require massive redistribution of church properties that comprised approximately 1/3 of Bohemian agricultural land, creating economic incentives for noble support of the Hussite movement. The fourth article demanded punishment for mortal sins regardless of the perpetrator's social status, challenging the legal immunities that had protected clerical criminals while expressing broader demands for social justice. This provision reflected popular anger at clerical corruption while asserting principles of legal equality that contradicted medieval social hierarchies. The article's implementation would require fundamental changes in legal procedures and judicial authority that extended far beyond religious reform to encompass comprehensive social transformation. The first defenestration of Prague on July 30th, 1419, transformed religious protest into open rebellion while establishing violent precedents that would characterize subsequent Hussite resistance to Catholic authority. The incident began as a procession led by radical preacher Jan Zalivsky to demand the release of Hussite prisoners held in Prague's new town hall. When municipal authorities refused to comply with these demands, the crowd forced entry into the building and threw several Catholic councillors from upper-story windows onto the pikes of supporters gathered below. The defenestration eliminated Catholic political leadership in Prague while demonstrating Hussite willingness to employ extreme violence against their opponents. The immediate aftermath of the defenestration witnessed the collapse of royal authority in Prague as Hussite radicals seized control of municipal government and began implementing religious reforms throughout the city. Catholic clergy fled to safer territories while their properties were confiscated and redistributed among Hussite supporters. The city's churches were purged of religious images and decorations that Hussites considered idolatrous, with valuable items sold to fund military preparations, while architectural modifications accommodated new liturgical practices. Archaeological investigations of Prague churches have revealed extensive evidence of this iconoclastic campaign, including damaged sculptures and altered altar arrangements. King Wenceslas IV's death in August 1419, reportedly triggered by apoplexy upon learning of the defenestration, eliminated the last hope for peaceful resolution of religious tensions while creating succession circumstances that would legitimize armed resistance to Catholic authority. His brother Sigismund's claim to the Bohemian throne faced immediate rejection from Hussite nobles who viewed him as responsible for Hus's death and feared that his rule would bring systematic persecution of Czech reformers. The succession crisis provided Hussites with legal justification for their rebellion, while creating opportunities for territorial expansion that would transform religious conflict into comprehensive social revolution. The Hussite military organisation that emerged during the winter of 1419 to 1420 represented one of the most innovative developments in medieval warfare, combining religious motivation with tactical innovations that would influence military development throughout Europe. The movement's early leaders included minor nobles and urban professionals who possessed sufficient education to understand complex theological arguments while maintaining connections with ordinary craftsmen and farmers who provided the movement's numerical strength. This social composition enabled Hussite forces to combine aristocratic military expertise with popular enthusiasm in ways that proved devastatingly effective against traditional feudal armies. Jan Žižka of Trocnov emerged as the movement's most capable military commander, bringing extensive combat experience from previous service in royal armies while demonstrating exceptional talent for innovative tactics and strategic planning. His background included participation in the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where he had observed the effectiveness of disciplined infantry formations against heavy cavalry charges. Žižka's early Hussite campaigns revealed his understanding of the movement's military limitations, while showcasing his ability to transform apparent weaknesses into tactical advantages that confounded enemy expectations. The war wagon formations that became synonymous with Hussite military success represented Žižka's most significant tactical innovation. creating mobile fortifications that provided protection for infantry forces while maintaining the flexibility necessary for offensive operations. These wagons, constructed according to standardized designs that enabled rapid deployment and effective coordination, incorporated iron reinforcements and specialized weapon mounts that transformed ordinary transport vehicles into formidable military equipment. The wagon's crews included crossbowmen, handgunners, and flail-wielding infantry who could deliver devastating firepower while remaining protected from cavalry charges that had traditionally dominated medieval battlefields. The Battle of Sudermaer on March 25, 1420, provided the first major demonstration of war wagon effectiveness while establishing Žižka's reputation as one of Europe's most innovative military commanders. His forces, numbering fewer than 400 men, faced a Catholic army of approximately 2,000 troops that included experienced knights and professional soldiers confident in their ability to crush peasant rebels. The Hussite deployment created a wagon fortress on elevated ground that channeled enemy attacks into predetermined killing zones, where crossbow and early firearm volleys could achieve maximum effectiveness against armoured opponents. The Catholic assault on the wagon fortress revealed the fundamental tactical problems that traditional heavy cavalry faced when confronting well-prepared defensive positions equipped with missile weapons. The knights' charges, which had proven decisive in countless previous battles, became suicidal attacks against protected infantry, who could reload and fire repeatedly while remaining safe from retaliation. The battle's outcome demonstrated that disciplined common soldiers armed with appropriate weapons could defeat the military elite that had dominated European warfare for centuries, encouraging similar tactical innovations throughout the continent. The siege of Prague in 1420 by Sigismund's forces provided Žižka with opportunities to demonstrate war wagon effectiveness in defensive operations while revealing the broader strategic implications of Hussite military innovations. The Imperial Army, which included contingents from throughout the Holy Roman Empire, employed traditional siege techniques that proved inadequate against defenders who could sortie from the city using mobile wagon fortresses that provided protection during withdrawal. The siege's failure after several months of ineffective operations demonstrated both Hussite defensive capabilities and the inadequacy of conventional military methods against innovative opponents. The Hussite counterattacks that followed the siege's collapse extended their territorial control throughout Bohemia, while demonstrating the offensive potential of war wagon tactics when properly coordinated with cavalry and infantry support. Žižka's forces captured numerous Catholic strongholds through systematic campaigns that combined siege warfare with mobile operations designed to prevent enemy reinforcement or relief. These victories provided Hussites with substantial military resources while eliminating Catholic bases that had threatened their territorial consolidation. The development of Hussite artillery capabilities represented another significant military innovation that enhanced their siege warfare effectiveness, while demonstrating their ability to adapt contemporary military technology to their specific tactical requirements. Hussite foundries produced cannon designs that emphasized mobility and rapid deployment rather than the massive siege guns that characterize contemporary artillery development. These weapons could be transported with war wagon formations while providing sufficient firepower to breach medieval fortifications that lacked the architectural modifications necessary to withstand gunpowder weapons. The Battle of Witkow Hill on July 14, 1420, showcased the defensive potential of combined war wagon and artillery tactics, while providing Žižka with his most celebrated victory against overwhelming numerical odds. The Hussite position, fortified with wagon barriers and artillery emplacements, faced assault by Sigismund's entire army in a desperate attempt to capture Prague through elimination of its primary defensive outpost. The battle's outcome demonstrated that properly prepared positions could withstand massive assaults while inflicting casualties that made continued siege operations impossible. The death of Jan Žižka in 1424 eliminated the Hussite movement's most capable military leader, while creating succession disputes that would fragment their forces and reduce their military effectiveness. His followers, who adopted the name orphans to commemorate their loss, continued employing the tactical innovations he had developed while struggling to maintain the strategic vision that had guided earlier campaigns. The fragmentation of Hussite military leadership into competing factions reduced their ability to coordinate large-scale operations while creating opportunities for Catholic forces to exploit internal divisions. Prokop the Great emerged as Žižka's most capable successor, combining military competence with political skills that enabled him to maintain Hussite unity during the movement's most challenging period. His background included university education and administrative experience that provided him with broader perspectives on the political implications of military operations, while his personal charisma enabled him to command respect from diverse Hussite factions. Prokop's leadership during the 1420s and early 1430s demonstrated both the continued effectiveness of Hussite military methods and the growing challenges posed by sustained warfare against superior enemy resources. The Great Moravian Campaign of 1423 to 1424, under Prokop's leadership, extended Hussite influence beyond traditional Bohemian boundaries while demonstrating their capacity for sustained offensive operations in foreign territories. The campaign's success in capturing major Moravian strongholds revealed both Hussite military capabilities and the weakness of Catholic defences in regions where local populations sympathise with reform movements. Archaeological evidence from captured Moravian castles shows extensive modifications made during Hussite occupation, including the construction of artillery positions and the elimination of religious imagery that conflicted with Hussite theological positions. The international expeditions that characterised the later 1420s represented the peak of Hussite military success, while revealing the movement's transformation from defensive rebellion into aggressive expansion that threatened Catholic Europe's stability. Hussite armies penetrated deep into Austria, Bavaria and Saxony, conducting systematic raids that generated substantial booty while demonstrating their ability to project power far beyond Bohemian territories. These campaigns created international coalitions against Hussite expansion, while providing them with resources necessary for continued military operations. The gradual exhaustion that characterised Hussite warfare during the early 1430s reflected both the enormous costs associated with sustained military operations and the movement's internal divisions regarding war aims and negotiation possibilities. The radical Taborite faction, centred in their fortified city of Tabor, advocated continued warfare until complete victory over Catholic forces, while moderate Hussites increasingly favoured negotiated settlements that would preserve their religious reforms within acceptable political frameworks. These divisions weakened Hussite military effectiveness, while creating opportunities for Catholic diplomatic initiatives designed to exploit internal disagreements. The Council of Basel's decision to engage in serious negotiations with Hussite representatives marked a fundamental shift in Catholic strategy from military suppression to diplomatic accommodation that recognised the impossibility of eliminating Hussite influence through force alone. The Council's invitation to Hussite theologians to present their positions before ecclesiastical authorities represented unprecedented recognition of heretical movements' legitimacy, while creating opportunities for compromise solutions that might preserve church unity. The negotiations that began in 1433 would ultimately produce the Compactata, agreement that ended the major phase of Hussite warfare while establishing precedents for religious accommodation that would influence European development for centuries. The Compactata of 1436, negotiated between moderate Hussite representatives and the Council of Basel, represented a remarkable compromise that preserved essential Hussite religious practices while restoring Bohemia's relationship with the broader Catholic Church. The agreement granted Bohemians the right to communion in both kinds, limited clerical property ownership and permitted vernacular religious services while requiring acknowledgement of papal authority and acceptance of Catholic theological positions on contested doctrines. These provisions satisfied moderate Hussite demands while providing Catholic authorities with face-saving formulas that enabled them to claim victory over heretical movements. The implementation of the Compactata required careful attention to the concerns of radical Hussite factions who viewed any accommodation with Catholic authority as a betrayal of their martyred leader's legacy. The Battle of Lipany on May 30th, 1434, where moderate Hussites allied with Catholic forces to defeat Taborite radicals, demonstrated both the depth of internal Hussite divisions and the determination of moderate leaders to pursue negotiated solutions regardless of radical opposition. The battle's outcome eliminated the most intransigent opponents of compromise, while clearing the way for the diplomatic agreements that would restore stability to Bohemian territories. George Podobredy's emergence as the dominant figure in post-war Bohemian politics reflected both his military capabilities and his sophisticated understanding of the diplomatic relationships necessary for sustained peace with Catholic neighbours. His early career included service in Hussite armies, where he had demonstrated competence in both conventional and war wagon tactics, while developing political connections that would prove crucial during his subsequent rise to power. George's appointment as regent for the young Ladislaus Posthumus provided him with opportunities to implement administrative reforms while maintaining the religious compromises that had ended the Hussite Wars. The restoration of royal authority under George's regency required careful balance between Hussite religious autonomy and the political relationships necessary for international recognition of Bohemian legitimacy. His policies maintained the essential provisions of the Compactata, while demonstrating Bohemian commitment to peaceful coexistence with Catholic neighbours. The reconstruction of war-damaged territories proceeded systematically under royal supervision, with new settlements established to replace communities destroyed during the conflicts, while existing towns received privileges that encouraged commercial recovery and population growth. George Podobredy's death in March 1471 created a succession crisis that would fundamentally alter Bohemia's political trajectory and mark the beginning of foreign dynastic rule that would persist for centuries. The Bohemian Diet, faced with choosing between George's son Henry of Podobredy and external candidates, ultimately rejected the principle of hereditary succession in favour of elective monarchy that would theoretically preserve greater noble autonomy. This decision reflected the Diet's determination to prevent the concentration of royal authority that had characterised the Luxembourg period, while maintaining the religious settlements that had ended the Hussite Wars. The nobles' choice of Władysław Jagiellon, son of Polish King Casimir IV, demonstrated their preference for a foreign ruler who would depend on their support rather than establish dynastic legitimacy. Władysław's election in May 1471 represented a calculated compromise between competing noble factions who sought to maximise their influence, while avoiding the internal conflicts that had plagued previous succession disputes. The electoral agreement established unprecedented limitations on royal authority, requiring Diet approval for major policy decisions including taxation, military campaigns and territorial grants. These constitutional restrictions reflected the nobles' determination to prevent royal absolutism while ensuring their continued dominance over Bohemian political structures. The new king's youth and unfamiliarity with Bohemian political traditions made him particularly dependent on noble guidance, creating circumstances that would fundamentally weaken royal prerogatives throughout his reign. The constitutional arrangements negotiated during Władysław's election established the Bohemian Diet as the kingdom's dominant political institution, with expanded authority over fiscal policy, military organisation, and administrative appointments. The Diet's composition reflected the social changes that had occurred during the Hussite period, with representation expanded beyond traditional noble estates to include wealthy burghers from major towns who'd gained political influence through their financial contributions to royal revenues. This broader representation created new dynamics within the Diet, as urban representatives often pursued commercial interests that conflicted with traditional noble priorities regarding territorial expansion and military expenditure. The religious settlement that accompanied Vladislaus's accession required careful navigation between Catholic restoration and preservation of Hussite rights that had been guaranteed by the Compactator. The new king's Catholic faith created immediate tensions with Hussite nobles who feared systematic persecution of their religious practices, while Catholic minorities hoped for restoration of traditional ecclesiastical authority. Vladislaus's early policies attempted to maintain the delicate balance established during George of Podobrady's regency, confirming Hussite communion practices while appointing Catholic administrators to key governmental positions. These compromises satisfied neither religious faction completely, while creating ongoing tensions that would influence Bohemian politics throughout the Jagiellonian period. The economic challenges that confronted Vladislaus's administration reflected both the long-term consequences of the Hussite Wars and changing international commercial patterns that reduced Bohemia's traditional trade advantages. The kingdom's silver mining operations, which had provided substantial revenues during the 14th century, faced declining production due to exhausted deposits and inadequate investment in new extraction technologies. Agricultural productivity remained below pre-war levels in many regions where population losses had not been fully recovered, while craft production struggled to compete with goods manufactured in Italian and Flemish centres that had developed more efficient production methods during Bohemia's period of internal conflict. The fiscal crisis that developed during the early 1470s demonstrated the fundamental weakness of royal authority under the new constitutional arrangements, as the Diet's control over taxation prevented systematic revenue collection, while noble exemptions reduced the tax base available for governmental operations. Traditional sources of royal income, including customs duties and mining revenues, proved insufficient to support both domestic administration and the military forces necessary for territorial defence. The resulting financial constraints forced Vladislaus to rely increasingly on noble cooperation for basic governmental functions, further weakening royal authority while strengthening the Diet's position as the kingdom's effective governing body. The military challenges that emerged during this period reveal the deterioration of Bohemian defensive capabilities that had occurred following the end of systematic warfare against external enemies. The professional forces that had characterized Hussite military organization had been largely disbanded following the Compactata, while the noble levies that replaced them lacked both the training and equipment necessary for effective resistance against well-organized enemies. The kingdom's fortifications, many of which had been damaged during the Hussite Wars, required substantial investment for restoration, while new military technologies demanded expensive artillery and firearms that strained limited royal resources. The Hungarian succession crisis that followed the death of Matthias Corvinus in 1490 provided Vladislaus with unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion, while creating military obligations that would strain Bohemian resources for decades. The Hungarian Diet's decision to elect Vladislaus as their king established a personal union between Bohemia and Hungary that theoretically doubled the territories under Jagiellonian authority. However, this expansion came at enormous cost as Hungarian territories faced constant Ottoman pressure along their southern frontiers, requiring military resources that Bohemia could ill afford while providing limited direct benefits to Bohemian commercial or strategic interests. The administrative challenges posed by governing two kingdoms with different legal traditions, religious compositions, and strategic priorities revealed the limitations of medieval governmental structures when confronted with expanded territorial responsibilities. Vladislaus established separate administrative systems for each kingdom while attempting to coordinate policies that affected both territories, creating bureaucratic complexities that strained available personnel while generating conflicts between competing national interests. The king's frequent absences from Bohemia to address Hungarian affairs weakened royal authority in Prague, while enabling the Diet to assert greater control over domestic policies. The Ottoman expansion into Hungarian territories during the 1490s created military pressures that would dominate Jagiellonian policy for the remainder of Władysław's reign, while demonstrating the kingdom's inadequate preparation for sustained warfare against a sophisticated enemy. Ottoman forces employed advanced siege techniques, disciplined infantry formations, and superior artillery that proved devastatingly effective against Hungarian fortifications designed to resist medieval rather than early modern military technologies. The systematic Ottoman conquest of Hungarian border fortresses eliminated defensive barriers that had protected Central Europe for centuries while creating refugee populations that strained resources throughout the region. The Battle of Krvava Field in 1493, where Ottoman forces destroyed a major Croatian army, demonstrated both the effectiveness of Ottoman military organisation and the inadequacy of traditional Central European defensive strategies against early modern warfare. The Croatian defeat eliminated one of Hungary's most important defensive barriers, while providing Ottoman forces with secure bases for further expansion into Hungarian heartlands. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield reveals the extensive use of firearms by Ottoman forces, including early muskets and artillery pieces that gave them decisive advantages over Croatian forces equipped primarily with traditional medieval weapons. The peasant unrest that characterized the late 15th and early 16th centuries reflected both the economic pressures created by increased taxation to fund military operations and the social tensions generated by noble efforts to expand their authority at peasant expense. The Bohemian peasantry, which had gained certain rights during the Hussite period, faced systematic efforts to reduce their legal status and increase their labour obligations to noble landlords. These pressures generated sporadic rebellions throughout Bohemian territories, with peasant bands attacking noble estates and destroying records of feudal obligations that had been imposed during the post-Hussite settlement. The Slovak peasant revolt of 1514, led by Georgi Dossa, represented the most serious challenge to noble authority during this period, and revealed the extent of social tensions that had developed throughout the Hungarian territories under Jagiellonian rule. The revolt began as a crusading expedition against Ottoman forces, but transformed into a comprehensive assault on noble privileges and feudal obligations. Dossa's forces captured numerous noble strongholds while implementing radical social reforms that eliminated feudal distinctions and redistributed noble properties among peasant supporters. The revolt's initial success demonstrated both popular discontent with existing social arrangements and the military potential of organised peasant forces when properly led and motivated. The suppression of Dossa's revolt required extensive military operations that revealed both the nobility's determination to preserve their privileges and their dependence on royal authority for protection against popular uprisings. The combined forces of Hungarian and Croatian nobles, supported by professional soldiers funded through emergency taxation, eventually defeated the peasant armies through superior equipment and coordination. The brutal repression that followed the revolt's collapse included mass executions and the implementation of harsh legal codes that further restricted peasant rights while strengthening noble authority over rural populations. The constitutional changes implemented following the peasant revolt reflected noble determination to prevent future challenges to their authority, while reducing royal power that might be used to support popular movements. The Tripartitum legal code, promulgated in 1514, systematically codified noble privileges while reducing peasant rights to levels that approached serfdom in many regions. These legal changes strengthened noble control over agricultural production while reducing the tax base available for royal revenues, creating fiscal constraints that would plague subsequent rulers throughout the early 16th century. Władysław's death in 1516 brought his 10-year-old son Louis II to the throne, during a period of unprecedented crisis as Ottoman forces prepared for systematic conquest of Hungarian territories, while internal divisions weakened the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The regency established for the young king reflected the political compromises that had characterized his father's reign, with authority divided among competing noble factions who pursued their own interests rather than coordinated national policies. The regency's inability to implement effective military reforms or generate adequate revenues for territorial defence created circumstances that would prove catastrophic when Ottoman forces launched their final assault on Hungarian independence. The Ottoman military preparations that characterised Suleiman the Magnificent's early reign demonstrated the systematic approach that would enable their conquest of Hungarian territories despite determined resistance from local populations. Ottoman forces employed advanced logistics systems that enabled sustained operations far from their base territories, while their artillery capabilities provided decisive advantages in siege warfare against fortifications that had not been modernised to resist gunpowder weapons. The recruitment of experienced European military engineers and artillery specialists enhanced Ottoman capabilities, while their diplomatic initiatives isolated Hungary from potential allies who might have provided effective assistance. The Siege of Belgrade in 1521 revealed both Ottoman military superiority and Hungarian defensive weaknesses that would characterise subsequent military encounters between the two powers. The fortress, which had successfully resisted previous Ottoman assaults, fell after a brief siege that demonstrated the effectiveness of Ottoman artillery against medieval fortifications. The capture of Belgrade eliminated Hungary's primary defensive barrier along the Danube River, while providing Ottoman forces with secure bases for further expansion into Hungarian heartlands. Archaeological investigations at Belgrade have revealed extensive evidence of the siege, including cannonballs and structural damage that demonstrate the intensity of the bombardment that determined the fortress's fate. The Hungarian Diet's desperate attempts to organise effective resistance during the early 1520s revealed both the kingdom's military potential and the political divisions that prevented effective coordination of defensive efforts. The Diet authorised substantial tax increases to fund military preparations, while negotiating with potential allies, including the Holy Roman Empire and Poland, for military assistance against Ottoman expansion. However, these efforts came too late to address the fundamental weaknesses in Hungarian military organisation, while internal political conflicts prevented effective implementation of defensive strategies. The marriage negotiations between Louis II and Mary of Austria, completed in 1515, represented the Hungarian Diet's attempt to secure Habsburg military support against Ottoman expansion while maintaining Hungarian independence under Jagiellonian rule. The marriage created diplomatic relationships with the Habsburg family that theoretically provided access to imperial military resources, while the reciprocal marriage between Archduke Ferdinand and Louis's sister Anna established dynastic connections that would prove crucial following Louis's death. These arrangements reflected sophisticated understanding of European diplomatic relationships while demonstrating Hungarian recognition of their inability to resist Ottoman expansion without external assistance. The final Ottoman campaign that culminated in the Battle of Mohacs represented Suleiman's systematic effort to eliminate Hungarian independence, while establishing Ottoman control over Central European territories that had previously remained outside Islamic influence. The Ottoman army that assembled for this campaign included approximately 100,000 troops, supported by advanced artillery and logistical systems that enabled sustained operations throughout Hungarian territories. The force's composition included elite janissary units, provincial cavalry formations, and specialised siege troops capable of reducing any fortification that might resist their advance. The Hungarian response to Ottoman invasion revealed both the kingdom's military limitations and the courage of nobles who chose to resist, despite overwhelming odds against their success. Louis II assembled approximately 25,000 troops for the decisive battle, including contingents from throughout the kingdom and small numbers of foreign volunteers who had answered calls for Christian solidarity against Islamic expansion. The Hungarian army's composition reflected traditional medieval military organisation, with heavy cavalry forming the core of their battle line, supported by infantry units that lacked the training and equipment necessary for effective resistance against Ottoman forces. The Battle of Mohacs on August 29, 1526, represented one of the most decisive military encounters in Central European history, as Ottoman forces systematically destroyed Hungarian military capabilities while eliminating the kingdom's political leadership. The battle began with Hungarian cavalry charges against Ottoman positions that initially achieved limited success before encountering disciplined janissary formations supported by artillery that proved devastatingly effective against armoured knights. The Hungarian forces, fighting with desperate courage, sustained enormous casualties while failing to achieve any significant tactical objectives that might have altered the battle's outcome. Louis II's death during the final stages of combat eliminated the last Jagiellonian ruler, while creating succession circumstances that would bring Habsburg authority to both Bohemia and Hungary. The young king's body, discovered in a marsh where he had apparently drowned while attempting to escape the battlefield, bore wounds that indicated he'd fought personally in the cavalry melees that characterised the battle's final phase. His death symbolised both the end of Hungarian independence and the collapse of the political arrangements that had governed Central Europe since the late 15th century. The immediate aftermath of Mohacs witnessed the rapid disintegration of Hungarian political structures as surviving nobles fled to secure territories while Ottoman forces systematically occupied strategic positions throughout the kingdom. The Hungarian Diet, reduced to a handful of survivors, faced the impossible choice between acknowledging Ottoman suzerainty or seeking Habsburg protection that would end Hungarian independence under different circumstances. The political vacuum created by military defeat enabled competing claimants to assert authority over different regions, while Ottoman forces consolidated their control over territories that had resisted Islamic expansion for centuries. The Bohemian Diet's decision to elect Ferdinand of Austria as their king represented both recognition of Habsburg military capabilities and acceptance of the political realities created by Ottoman expansion in Central Europe. Ferdinand's candidacy offered the prospect of imperial military support against potential Ottoman expansion into Bohemian territories, while his marriage to Louis II's sister provided dynastic legitimacy for Habsburg claims. The electoral agreement established constitutional limitations on royal authority similar to those that had characterised Jagiellonian rule, ensuring continued noble dominance over Bohemian political structures while providing Habsburg rulers with access to the kingdom's resources and strategic position within Central Europe. Ferdinand's coronation as King of Bohemia in Prague Castle on February 24, 1527, marked the beginning of Habsburg rule that would fundamentally transform the kingdom's political, religious and cultural landscape over the subsequent century. The ceremony itself reflected the delicate balance between Habsburg dynastic ambitions and Bohemian constitutional traditions, as Ferdinand accepted the crown under conditions negotiated with the Diet that preserved noble privileges while acknowledging his authority as a hereditary monarch. The coronation regalia, including the crown of St. Wenceslas with its distinctive fleur-de-lis design and precious stone inlays, symbolise continuity with Bohemian royal traditions, even as political power shifted decisively toward Vienna and the broader Habsburg imperial system. The constitutional arrangements that accompanied Ferdinand's accession established a framework for Habsburg-Bohemian relations that would persist throughout the 16th century, while creating inherent tensions between royal prerogatives and noble autonomy. The Bohemian Diet retained control over taxation and military levies, requiring royal negotiation for revenue collection, while maintaining the right to approve or reject proposed legislation. These limitations on royal authority reflected the nobles' determination to preserve the political gains achieved during the Jagiellonian period, while recognizing their need for Habsburg military protection against potential Ottoman expansion. Archaeological evidence from noble estates throughout Bohemia reveals extensive fortification improvements undertaken during this period, suggesting continued concerns about territorial security despite Habsburg guarantees of protection. Ferdinand's early administrative reforms demonstrated his understanding of the need to balance imperial integration with respect for Bohemian institutional traditions. He retained existing governmental structures while introducing Habsburg administrative practices that enhanced bureaucratic efficiency and improved coordination between Bohemian and Austrian territories. The establishment of new record-keeping systems enabled more systematic tax collection and military organisation, while preserving the legal frameworks that governed noble privileges and municipal autonomy. These changes created hybrid governmental structures that combined Habsburg centralisation with Bohemian particularism in ways that satisfied immediate political needs while establishing precedents for future conflicts over constitutional authority. The religious settlement that Ferdinand negotiated during his early reign required careful attention to the complex denominational divisions that had characterized Bohemian Christianity since the Hussite Wars. The kingdom's population included substantial Catholic minorities concentrated in urban areas and along the Austrian border, Hussite communities that maintained their traditional practices under the Compactator agreements, and growing numbers of Lutheran converts attracted by German Protestant teachings. Ferdinand's own Catholic faith created immediate tensions with Protestant nobles who feared systematic persecution, while his imperial obligations required policies that would satisfy papal expectations regarding counter-Reformation objectives. The resulting religious policies attempted to maintain existing denominational arrangements while gradually strengthening Catholic institutional authority through careful appointment of ecclesiastical officials and educational reforms. The economic integration of Bohemian territories into the broader Habsburg imperial system created new opportunities for commercial development while generating tensions regarding taxation and resource allocation. Ferdinand's policies encouraged trade relationships between Bohemian merchants and partners throughout the Habsburg domains, including access to Mediterranean markets through Trieste and expanded commercial connections with Spanish territories in Italy and the Low Countries. However, these benefits came at the cost of increased taxation to support imperial military operations and administrative expenses that often served Austrian rather than specifically Bohemian interests. The development of new silver mining operations in the Bohemian mountains provided substantial revenues for imperial coffers while employing advanced extraction techniques borrowed from Spanish colonial mining experiences in the Americas. The Ottoman siege of Vienna in 1529 demonstrated both the strategic importance of Bohemian territories within the Habsburg defensive system and the kingdom's vulnerability to Islamic expansion that had already eliminated Hungarian independence. Ferdinand's mobilization of Bohemian military resources for Vienna's defense required extensive negotiations with the Diet regarding troop levies and financial contributions, revealing the constitutional limitations that constrained royal authority even during existential crises. Bohemian forces that participated in Vienna's defense included approximately 8,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry equipped with firearms and artillery that reflected the military modernization that had occurred under Habsburg rule. The siege's ultimate failure resulted from multiple factors including Ottoman logistical difficulties, Habsburg defensive preparations, and the early onset of winter weather that forced Suleiman's withdrawal before the city's fortifications could be breached. The military reforms that Ferdinand implemented following the Ottoman threat revealed his determination to modernize Bohemian defensive capabilities while integrating kingdom forces into the broader imperial military system. New fortification designs incorporated the latest developments in artillery-resistant architecture. with star-shaped bastions and geometric defensive systems that could withstand bombardment from contemporary siege guns. The construction of these fortifications required substantial financial investment and technical expertise, leading to the recruitment of Italian military engineers who had developed their skills during the Italian Wars. Archaeological investigations at sites including Terezin and other border fortifications reveal the sophisticated engineering that characterized these defensive improvements, including underground galleries, specialized artillery positions, and advanced water management systems that enabled extended siege resistance. The expansion of firearms production within Bohemian territories reflected both military necessity and economic opportunity as demand for advanced weapons increased throughout Central Europe. Bohemian armaments workshops developed expertise in manufacturing muskets, pistols, and artillery pieces that combined German metallurgical techniques with innovations developed through practical military experience. The kingdom's iron ore deposits provided raw materials for weapons production, while skilled craftsmen trained in German and Italian workshops established manufacturing centres in Prague and other major towns. These developments created new sources of revenue for royal coffers while providing employment for urban populations that had suffered during previous periods of political instability. Ferdinand's death in 1564 brought his son Maximilian second to the Bohemian throne during a period of relative stability that enabled the new king to pursue more ambitious policies regarding religious accommodation and cultural development. Maximilian's education had exposed him to humanist scholarship and Renaissance artistic traditions that influenced his approach to governance, while his personal religious convictions, which some contemporaries suspected included Protestant sympathies, enabled him to navigate denominational conflicts with greater flexibility than his strictly Catholic father had demonstrated. The new king's court in Prague attracted scholars, artists, and musicians from throughout Europe, while his patronage of architectural projects enhanced the city's reputation as a major cultural centre. The religious policies that Maximilian developed during the 1560s and 1570s represented a sophisticated attempt to balance Counter-Reformation objectives with practical recognition of Protestant strength within Bohemian territories. Rather than pursuing systematic persecution of Protestant communities, Maximilian adopted policies of selective tolerance that maintained Catholic institutional authority while permitting Protestant worship under regulated conditions. These arrangements satisfied moderate Protestant nobles who sought religious security rather than political confrontation, while enabling Catholic authorities to claim progress toward denominational unity without provoking the armed resistance that more aggressive policies might have generated. Archaeological evidence from rural parishes throughout Bohemia reveals the construction of new churches during this period that incorporated architectural features suitable for both Catholic and Protestant liturgical practices, suggesting practical accommodation at local levels despite ongoing theological disagreements. The Bohemian Confession of 1575 represented the culmination of Protestant efforts to secure formal recognition of their religious rights, while demonstrating the sophisticated theological scholarship that had developed within Reformed communities since the early 16th century. The Confession's authors, led by prominent nobles including Václav Budovec of Budov and other educated Protestant leaders, created a comprehensive statement of faith that combined Lutheran doctrinal positions with elements derived from Hussite traditions and Calvinist theological innovations. The document's careful theological argumentation reflected its author's understanding of the need to present Protestant positions in ways that would satisfy imperial scrutiny, while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that differentiated Bohemian Protestantism from German Lutheran orthodoxy. Maximilian's acceptance of the Bohemian Confession marked a significant departure from previous Habsburg religious policies, while establishing precedents for denominational coexistence that would influence Central European development for decades. The king's formal recognition of Protestant rights included guarantees of religious worship, educational autonomy, and legal protection that provided security for reformed communities while establishing clear boundaries for their activities. These arrangements created a complex religious settlement that satisfied immediate political needs while generating ongoing tensions between Catholic restoration efforts and Protestant institutional development. The implementation of these agreements required careful attention to local circumstances throughout Bohemian territories, with different regions developing varying approaches to denominational coexistence based on their specific demographic and political conditions. The cultural flowering that characterized Maximilian's reign reflected both the resources made available through economic development and the international connections that Habsburg rule had established with artistic centers throughout Europe. Prague Castle underwent extensive renovation projects that incorporated Renaissance architectural elements while preserving Gothic structural features that connected the complex with Bohemian historical traditions. The castle's new residential quarters included elaborate decorative programs that combined Italian artistic techniques with local craftsmanship traditions, creating distinctive architectural styles that influenced building projects throughout Central Europe. The expansion of the castle's gardens employed advanced horticultural techniques borrowed from Italian Renaissance villa designs, while incorporating plant species from throughout the Habsburg domains that demonstrated the dynasty's global reach. The establishment of new educational institutions during this period reflected Maximilian's commitment to intellectual development, while serving practical needs for trained administrators and clergy capable of managing the kingdom's complex religious and political arrangements. The expansion of Prague University's curriculum included new faculties that offered instruction in mathematics, natural philosophy, and modern languages that prepared students for careers in governmental service or commercial activities. The university's library received substantial additions through royal patronage and private donations, acquiring manuscripts and printed books that enhanced its reputation as a major centre of scholarly research. Archaeological investigations of university buildings from this period reveal extensive construction projects that provided adequate facilities for expanded educational activities while incorporating architectural innovations that reflected contemporary academic developments. The succession of Rudolf II in 1576 initiated the most remarkable period of cultural and intellectual achievement in Bohemian history, while establishing Prague as one of Europe's most important centres of Renaissance learning and artistic patronage. Rudolf's decision to transfer the imperial capital from Vienna to Prague reflected both his personal preferences for the city's cultural atmosphere and strategic calculations regarding the advantages of governing the empire from a more central location. The transfer required massive expansion of governmental facilities and residential accommodations that transformed Prague's urban landscape while attracting thousands of courtiers, administrators, artists, and scholars who contributed to the city's cosmopolitan character. Rudolf's court became renowned throughout Europe for its patronage of scientific research, artistic innovation, and intellectual inquiry that attracted leading figures from diverse fields of learning. The emperor's personal interests in astronomy, alchemy, and natural philosophy created an environment where experimental investigation flourished alongside traditional scholarly pursuits. Tycho Brahe's arrival in Prague in 1599 established the city as a major centre of astronomical research, with his observations from the Imperial Observatory contributing fundamental data that would later support Johannes Kepler's revolutionary theories of planetary motion. The observatory's sophisticated instruments, including large brass quadrants and celestial globes, represented the most advanced scientific equipment available in contemporary Europe, while their precise construction demonstrated the high level of craftsmanship that imperial patronage had fostered. The imperial collections that Rudolf assembled during his reign created one of Europe's most remarkable concentrations of artistic and scientific objects while demonstrating the global reach of Habsburg commercial and diplomatic networks. The Kunstkammer housed paintings by leading contemporary artists, including Giuseppe Arcimboldo, whose composite portraits combine naturalistic detail with symbolic complexity that appealed to Rudolph's intellectual interests. The collection also included scientific instruments, mechanical automata, exotic natural specimens, and archaeological artifacts that reflected the emperor's wide-ranging curiosity about the natural world and human creativity. Archaeological excavations in Prague Castle have uncovered remains of workshops where court artisans created decorative objects and scientific instruments, revealing the sophisticated manufacturing capabilities that imperial patronage had developed. The alchemical laboratories that Rudolf established within Prague Castle attracted practitioners from throughout Europe, who sought imperial patronage for their experimental investigations into the transformation of matter and the discovery of universal principles governing natural phenomena. These facilities included furnaces, distillation apparatus, and extensive libraries of alchemical texts that enabled systematic research into chemical processes while maintaining the secrecy that practitioners considered essential for their work. The laboratory's activities combined practical metallurgy and pharmaceutical preparation with theoretical investigations that contributed to the gradual development of modern chemistry, despite their foundation in medieval alchemical traditions. The religious tensions that developed during Rudolf's later reign reflected both his personal withdrawal from active governance and the growing polarization between Catholic and Protestant factions throughout the Habsburg domains. The emperor's increasing reclusiveness and apparent mental instability created opportunities for competing religious and political factions to assert greater influence over imperial policy, while reducing the careful balance that had characterized previous decades. Catholic authorities, encouraged by Counter-Reformation successes in other European territories, began pressing for more aggressive policies against Protestant communities, while Protestant nobles sought to strengthen their legal protections against potential persecution. These tensions generated ongoing conflicts regarding ecclesiastical appointments, educational policies, and legal jurisdictions that would ultimately contribute to the crisis that erupted following Rudolf's death. The Letter of Majesty that Rudolf issued in 1609 represented his final attempt to resolve religious conflicts through comprehensive guarantees of Protestant rights while maintaining imperial authority over Bohemian territories. The document confirmed Protestant nobles' rights to build churches, appoint clergy, and educate their children according to reformed theological principles, while establishing procedures for resolving denominational disputes that might arise in mixed communities. These provisions satisfied immediate Protestant demands while creating institutional frameworks that theoretically could accommodate continued denominational diversity within a unified political system. However, the letter's implementation required continued imperial support that became uncertain as Rudolf's mental condition deteriorated and succession disputes intensified. The Donauworth incident of 1607 demonstrated the broader imperial tensions that would ultimately undermine the religious settlements that Rudolf had attempted to establish within Bohemian territories. The suppression of Protestant rights in this Bavarian city by Catholic authorities, supported by imperial forces, revealed the fragility of denominational compromises when confronted with determined opposition from Counter-Reformation advocates. Protestant princes throughout the empire interpreted the incident as evidence of systematic Catholic efforts to eliminate reformed communities despite existing legal guarantees, leading to the formation of defensive alliances that would contribute to the polarization that characterized early 17th century German politics. The formation of the Protestant Union in 1608 and the Catholic League in 1609 created competing alliance systems that transformed local religious disputes into potential catalysts for empire-wide conflicts, while placing Bohemian Protestants in increasingly precarious positions. The Protestant Union's membership included several important German princes who possessed sufficient military resources to resist Catholic expansion, while the Catholic League's formation under Bavarian leadership provided institutional framework for coordinated counter-Reformation policies. These developments created external pressures that influenced Bohemian denominational conflicts, while providing both Protestant and Catholic factions with potential sources of military support for future confrontations. Rudolph's death in January 1612 brought his brother Matthias to the imperial throne during a period of unprecedented religious and political tension throughout the Habsburg domains. Matthias had already assumed control over Hungarian and Austrian territories through agreements negotiated during Rudolph's final years, creating circumstances where his succession to Bohemian royal authority represented consolidation of Habsburg power rather than new dynastic arrangements. However, the new emperor's advanced age and lack of direct heirs created immediate concerns about future succession that would influence political calculations throughout his brief reign. The Bohemian Diet's acceptance of Matthias reflected both constitutional precedent regarding Habsburg hereditary rights and practical recognition of the military realities that made resistance to imperial authority extremely dangerous. The religious policies that Matthias implemented during his reign reflected both his personal Catholic convictions and practical recognition of the need to maintain stability within territories that contained substantial Protestant populations. His confirmation of the Letter of Majesty satisfied immediate Protestant demands, while his appointment of Catholic officials to key administrative positions demonstrated his commitment to gradual counter-Reformation objectives. These policies created ongoing tensions between official religious tolerance and practical discrimination that would contribute to the crisis that erupted following his death. Archaeological evidence from Protestant churches throughout Bohemia reveals modifications made during this period that suggest concerns about potential Catholic interference with Reformed worship practices, including the construction of concealed meeting spaces and the removal of decorative elements that might attract unwanted attention. The succession arrangements that Matthias negotiated during his final years established his cousin Ferdinand of Styria as heir to Habsburg territories, while creating circumstances that would test the constitutional frameworks that had governed Bohemian politics since the early 16th century. Ferdinand's reputation as a committed counter-Reformation advocate generated immediate concerns among Protestant nobles who feared systematic persecution of Reformed communities under his rule. The Bohemian Diet's reluctant acceptance of Ferdinand's succession reflected both constitutional precedent and recognition of their limited ability to resist Habsburg dynastic claims without external military support that was unlikely to materialize, given the complex international circumstances that characterized early 17th century European politics. The growing tensions that characterized the final years of Matthias's reign reflected both specific concerns about Ferdinand's succession and broader anxieties regarding the future of Protestant communities throughout Central Europe. The Catholic victories in the Jülich-Cleves succession dispute and other contemporary conflicts demonstrated the effectiveness of counter-Reformation military strategies, while revealing Protestant weaknesses in coordinating defensive efforts against systematic Catholic expansion. These developments created psychological pressures within Bohemian Protestant communities that contributed to the radicalization that would ultimately lead to open rebellion against Habsburg authority. The construction of new fortifications at Protestant noble estates throughout Bohemia during this period suggests preparation for potential military resistance despite the enormous risks associated with confronting imperial power. Matthias's death on March 20th, 1619, created the succession crisis that would transform local Bohemian religious and constitutional disputes into the catalyst for the most devastating conflict in European history. Ferdinand II's accession to imperial authority coincided with his assumption of Bohemian royal titles, creating circumstances where opposition to his rule would constitute rebellion against both kingdom and empire. The new emperor's immediate implementation of counter-Reformation policies, including the appointment of Catholic officials to positions previously held by Protestants and restrictions on reformed educational activities, confirmed Protestant fears regarding his intentions, while providing justification for the resistance that had been developing throughout the previous decade. The Second Defenestration of Prague on May 23, 1618, represented the culmination of mounting tensions between Protestant nobles and imperial authorities, while establishing violent precedents that would characterize the subsequent conflict. The incident began as a confrontation between Protestant representatives and imperial governors regarding the implementation of religious policies that Protestants considered violations of the Letter of Majesty's guarantees. When negotiations failed to resolve these disputes, Protestant leaders, including Count Thurn, physically expelled the imperial governors Martinitz and Slavata from windows of Prague Castle's council chamber, recreating the dramatic gesture that had initiated the Hussite Revolution 2 centuries earlier. The governors' survival after their fall into the castle moat's refuse heap was attributed by Catholics to miraculous intervention, while Protestants claimed their thick coats had cushioned their landing, creating competing narratives that reflected the deeper ideological divisions that separated the opposing factions. The immediate aftermath of the defenestration witnessed the rapid collapse of imperial authority throughout Bohemian territories as Protestant nobles assumed control of governmental institutions, while beginning military preparations for the conflict they recognized was now inevitable. The formation of a provisional government under Protestant leadership eliminated Habsburg administrative authority, while establishing new constitutional arrangements that theoretically restored the elective monarchy that had characterized pre-Habsburg Bohemian politics. These changes required extensive reorganization of governmental structures and military forces while creating diplomatic opportunities for alliances with other European powers that opposed Habsburg hegemony. The speed and effectiveness of these organizational efforts demonstrated the sophisticated planning that had preceded the defenestration, while revealing the extent of Protestant preparation for armed resistance against imperial authority. The Protestant rebellion that had erupted following the Second Defenestration of Prague created unprecedented opportunities for Ferdinand II to reshape Bohemian political and religious structures according to counter-Reformation principles, while eliminating the constitutional limitations that had constrained Habsburg authority for nearly a century. The emperor's systematic response to the crisis combined diplomatic isolation of Protestant forces with military preparations that would enable decisive intervention once international circumstances permitted effective action. Ferdinand's negotiations with Catholic allies throughout Europe, including Pope Paul V, Philip III of Spain, and Maximilian of Bavaria, created financial and military resources that far exceeded anything the Bohemian Protestant rebels could mobilize through their limited alliance networks with German Protestant princes and potential Ottoman support. The military preparations that Ferdinand undertook during 1619 and early 1620 demonstrated the sophisticated logistical capabilities that the Habsburg imperial system had developed through decades of warfare against Ottoman forces and rebellious subjects throughout the dynasty's diverse territories. Imperial recruiting agents operated throughout Catholic regions of the Holy Roman Empire, offering attractive terms of service that drew experienced soldiers from previous campaigns in Hungary, Italy, and the Low Countries. These professional forces included Spanish tercios veterans, whose disciplined infantry formations had proven devastatingly effective in contemporary European warfare, while German Catholic cavalry units provided mobile strike capabilities that could exploit tactical opportunities created by coordinated infantry and artillery operations. The Catholic League's military contributions to Ferdinand's campaign reflected both religious solidarity against Protestant rebellion and strategic calculations regarding the advantages of eliminating Bohemian Protestant influence within the imperial system. Maximilian of Bavaria's forces included approximately 25,000 well-trained troops equipped with modern firearms and artillery pieces manufactured in Augsburg workshops that had developed advanced metallurgical techniques through decades of weapons production for imperial armies. The Bavarian army's organizational structure incorporated lessons learned from previous conflicts, including standardized supply procedures, medical services, and communication systems that enabled effective coordination during extended campaign operations in foreign territories. The Protestant military response to imperial preparations revealed both the determination of Bohemian rebels and the fundamental weaknesses that would ultimately determine their defeat. The Bohemian estates' attempts to create effective military forces faced enormous challenges, including limited financial resources, inadequate weapons production capabilities, and the absence of experienced military leadership capable of coordinating resistance against professional imperial armies. The rebels' early military efforts focused on securing control of strategic fortifications throughout Bohemian territories, while attempting to establish alliance relationships with Protestant powers that could provide the external support necessary for sustained resistance against Habsburg military superiority. Christian of Anhalt's appointment as commander of Protestant forces represented the rebels' attempt to acquire professional military leadership, while his previous experience in Dutch service against Spanish forces provided valuable knowledge of contemporary military techniques and organizational methods. However, Christian's forces remained fundamentally inferior to imperial armies in terms of equipment, training, and logistical support. While his strategic position required defensive operations that negated many advantages the Protestant forces might have possessed through superior knowledge of local terrain and population support. The Protestant army that assembled during the summer of 1620 included approximately 21,000 troops, drawn from Bohemian levies, German Protestant auxiliaries, and Hungarian allies, whose military effectiveness varied considerably based on their previous combat experience and equipment quality. The campaign that culminated in the Battle of White Mountain began with imperial forces crossing into Bohemian territory in September 1620, employing systematic advance procedures that secured their supply lines while preventing Protestant forces from conducting effective harassment operations against their columns. The imperial army's movement toward Prague demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the strategic requirements for successful siege operations against a major fortified city, including the establishment of secure bases for artillery positions and the coordination of multiple approach routes that would enable encirclement of defensive positions. Archaeological evidence from the campaign route reveals extensive evidence of imperial military organization, including standardized camp layouts, defensive earthworks, and supply depot locations that reflect advanced logistical planning. The Protestant decision to meet imperial forces in open battle rather than conducting siege defense of Prague reflected both strategic calculations regarding their inability to withstand extended siege operations and political pressures from nobles who demanded active resistance rather than passive defense. The Protestant army's deployment on White Mountain, a low ridge west of Prague, provided defensive advantages including elevated positions for artillery placement and clear fields of fire against advancing enemy formations. However, the position also created tactical limitations by preventing effective retreat if the battle developed unfavourably while exposing Protestant forces to potential flanking manoeuvres that could exploit the relatively open terrain surrounding their defensive positions. The Battle of White Mountain on November 8, 1620, began with artillery exchanges that demonstrated the superior quality and quantity of imperial cannon compared to Protestant ordnance, with Catholic gunners achieving more accurate fire that disrupted enemy formations while maintaining better protection for their own equipment and personnel. The imperial artillery bombardment included both direct fire against Protestant infantry positions and indirect fire that targeted command posts and supply areas behind enemy lines. Archaeological investigations at the battlefield have revealed numerous cannonballs and artillery fragments that indicate the intensity of the bombardment, with iron projectiles ranging from small anti-personnel rounds to large siege gun ammunition designed to breach fortified positions. The infantry assault that followed the artillery preparation showcased the tactical superiority of imperial forces while revealing the fundamental weaknesses in Protestant military organisation that had developed during their brief period of independence. The Catholic advance employed coordinated formations that combined pike squares with musketeer units in ways that maximised firepower while maintaining defensive capabilities against cavalry charges. The Spanish tercios veterans, who formed the core of imperial infantry, demonstrated the discipline and tactical flexibility that had made them Europe's most feared soldiers, advancing steadily despite Protestant resistance, while maintaining formation integrity that enabled effective mutual support between different units. The Protestant resistance during the battle's initial phases demonstrated considerable individual courage, while revealing the organisational problems that prevented effective coordination between different elements of their army. Protestant infantry units fought tenaciously from their defensive positions, inflicting significant casualties on advancing imperial forces through effective use of firearms and artillery. However, the lack of experienced officers capable of coordinating tactical responses to changing battlefield conditions prevented Protestant forces from exploiting opportunities that might have altered the battle's outcome. The absence of adequate reserves that could reinforce threatened positions or exploit tactical successes created circumstances where initial defensive advantages were gradually eroded through sustained imperial pressure. The cavalry engagement that developed on the battle's northern flank proved decisive in determining the overall outcome as imperial horsemen successfully outflanked Protestant positions while preventing effective withdrawal of defeated infantry units. The Catholic cavalry included both German heavy cavalry equipped with armour and firearms and Croatian light cavalry, whose mobility and harassment tactics proved particularly effective against disorganised enemy formations. The collapse of Protestant cavalry resistance eliminated their ability to protect infantry flanks while creating panic that spread throughout their entire army as soldiers recognised that organised retreat had become impossible. The route that followed the collapse of Protestant defensive positions demonstrated both the completeness of imperial victory and the devastating consequences that awaited defeated rebel forces. Protestant soldiers fled toward Prague in complete disorder, abandoning equipment and supplies while imperial cavalry pursued them with systematic efficiency that maximised casualties among the defeated enemy. The pursuit continued for several miles, with imperial forces capturing or killing thousands of Protestant troops who had thrown away weapons and equipment in their desperate attempts to escape. Archaeological evidence along the retreat route includes discarded military equipment, personal possessions, and human remains that indicate the scale of the disaster that befell Protestant forces. The immediate aftermath of White Mountain witnessed the systematic elimination of Protestant political leadership through executions that demonstrated Ferdinand II's determination to prevent future rebellions while establishing Habsburg authority on foundations that could not be challenged by constitutional opposition. The imperial commissioners who assumed control of Prague began immediate investigations to identify rebel leaders and their supporters, employing interrogation techniques and documentary evidence to compile comprehensive lists of individuals who had participated in or supported the Protestant rebellion. These investigations revealed the extensive network of noble families, urban leaders, and ecclesiastical figures who had contributed to the revolt, while providing legal justification for the massive confiscations and executions that would follow. The public executions carried out in Prague's Old Town Square on June 21, 1621, represented one of the most dramatic demonstrations of royal justice in Central European history, while establishing precedents for absolute monarchy that would characterize Habsburg rule for the next century. 27 prominent Protestant leaders, including nobles, university professors, and urban patricians, were beheaded or hanged before crowds that had been compelled to witness the consequences of rebellion against imperial authority. The execution site was carefully chosen for maximum symbolic impact, with scaffolds erected in the kingdom's most important public space, where royal proclamations had traditionally been announced, and where the community's collective identity was most strongly expressed. Count Joachim Andreas Schlick, who had served as one of the rebellion's military commanders, faced execution with dignity that impressed even Catholic observers, while his final speech emphasized his continued commitment to Protestant theological principles despite his political defeat. Schlick's background included extensive military experience in Dutch service against Spanish forces, making his capture and execution particularly significant for imperial authorities who sought to eliminate experienced military leadership that might inspire future resistance. His death eliminated one of the few Protestant commanders who possessed the professional competence necessary for effective organization of rebel military forces. Dr. Jan Jasenius, the Slovak-born physician and university professor, who had served as rector of Prague University during the rebellion, represented the intellectual leadership that imperial authorities considered particularly dangerous to their long-term control objectives. Jasenius had authored several treatises defending Protestant theological positions, while his medical expertise had made him a respected figure throughout Central European scholarly circles. His execution demonstrated Ferdinand's determination to eliminate not only political opposition, but also the intellectual foundations that had supported Protestant resistance to Catholic authority. Václav Budovec of Budov, whose family had played prominent roles in Bohemian politics since the late medieval period, faced execution as one of the rebellion's most articulate defenders of Protestant constitutional principles. Budovec had authored numerous political treatises that argued for limitations on royal authority, while defending noble privileges that had been guaranteed by previous constitutional arrangements. His death symbolized the elimination of the constitutional tradition that had constrained Habsburg power, while establishing precedents for absolute monarchy that would govern Bohemian politics throughout the subsequent century. The confiscation procedures that accompanied the executions represented the most systematic redistribution of property in Bohemian history, while providing Ferdinand with the resources necessary to reward Catholic supporters and establish new social foundations for Habsburg rule. Imperial commissioners conducted detailed inventories of rebel properties that included not only landed estates, but also urban properties, commercial enterprises, and personal possessions that could be liquidated to fund governmental operations. These confiscations affected approximately 680 noble families and thousands of urban property owners, creating economic disruption that would influence Bohemian social development for generations while eliminating the material foundations of Protestant political influence. The redistribution of confiscated properties to Catholic nobles and imperial supporters created new social hierarchies that would characterize Bohemian society throughout the early modern period, while ensuring loyalty to Habsburg authority through material incentives that tied elite interest to dynastic survival. The recipients of redistributed properties included Spanish and Italian nobles who had supported Ferdinand during the rebellion, German Catholic families who could provide administrative expertise, and Bohemian Catholics who had remained loyal during the crisis. Archaeological evidence from noble estates throughout Bohemia reveals extensive construction projects undertaken by new owners who sought to demonstrate their elevated social status while adapting properties to contemporary architectural standards that reflected their cultural backgrounds and aesthetic preferences. The Jesuit educational initiatives that accompanied the political transformation represented Ferdinand's systematic effort to create new intellectual foundations for Catholic authority, while eliminating the Protestant scholarly traditions that had flourished at Prague University and other educational institutions throughout Bohemian territories. The Society of Jesus received extensive privileges and financial support that enabled them to establish schools throughout the kingdom while assuming control of university education that would shape future generations of Bohemian intellectual and political leadership. The Jesuit curriculum emphasized classical languages, Catholic theology, and scholastic philosophy while eliminating the humanist educational approaches that had characterized Protestant academic institutions. The Clementinum complex in Prague became the center of Jesuit educational activities, while its extensive library and astronomical observatory demonstrated the intellectual sophistication that Catholic educational institutions could achieve through adequate financial support and international scholarly networks. The Jesuit professors who staffed these institutions included scholars trained at leading Catholic universities throughout Europe, bringing advanced knowledge of contemporary intellectual developments while maintaining strict adherence to Counter-Reformation theological principles. Archaeological investigations of Jesuit buildings throughout Bohemia reveal the extensive construction projects that accompanied their educational expansion, including specialized facilities for scientific instruction, library storage, and residential accommodation for international faculty and students. The linguistic policies implemented during the early decades of Habsburg absolutism reflected systematic efforts to reduce Czech cultural autonomy while promoting German administrative and cultural dominance throughout Bohemian territories. Imperial decrees established German as the primary language for governmental operations, legal proceedings, and commercial transactions, while restricting Czech usage to informal communications and religious services for rural populations. These policies created practical advantages for German-speaking administrators and merchants, while systematically disadvantaging Czech speakers who sought advancement in governmental, commercial, or ecclesiastical careers. The implementation of the Robota system represented Ferdinand's response to the labour shortages created by population losses during the rebellion and subsequent emigration of Protestant families to territories that offered religious tolerance. The new system required peasants to provide specified amounts of unpaid labour to noble landlords, while restricting their freedom of movement and economic activities in ways that approached serfdom in many regions. These arrangements provided nobles with the agricultural labour necessary for estate operations, while ensuring social stability through legal restrictions that prevented peasant mobility and political organisation. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements reveals the construction of new manor houses and agricultural buildings that reflected increased noble control over rural populations, while demonstrating the architectural preferences of new Catholic landowners. The Catholic architectural transformation that characterized the mid-17th century created distinctive Baroque landscapes throughout Bohemian territories, while demonstrating the cultural ambitions of new religious and political authorities. The reconstruction of Prague Castle incorporated Italian Baroque design elements, while preserving Gothic structural features that connected the complex with Bohemian historical traditions. The castle's new ceremonial spaces included elaborate decorative programs that emphasized Habsburg dynastic legitimacy, while religious imagery reinforced Catholic theological principles that had replaced Protestant alternatives. The scale and sophistication of these architectural projects required substantial financial investment, while employing craftsmen from throughout Catholic Europe who introduced new artistic techniques and decorative traditions. The parish church construction that accompanied Catholic restoration created new religious landscapes throughout rural Bohemia, while providing architectural settings appropriate for Counter-Reformation liturgical practices. These buildings incorporated Baroque design elements, including dramatic lighting effects, elaborate altar installations, and sophisticated sculptural programs that emphasize Catholic theological principles, while creating emotionally powerful worship experiences. The church's decorative programs often included imagery that specifically refuted Protestant theological positions, while celebrating Catholic saints and religious practices that had been eliminated during the Protestant period. Archaeological investigations of rural churches reveal the extensive modifications made to existing buildings, while new construction employed standardized design elements that reflected centralized planning by ecclesiastical authorities. The gradual economic recovery that characterized the later 17th century reflected both the restoration of political stability and the integration of Bohemian territories into broader Habsburg commercial networks that provided access to markets throughout Central and Southern Europe. The development of new manufacturing industries, including textile production and metalworking, created urban employment opportunities while generating revenues that supported continued architectural and cultural projects. The expansion of agricultural production on redistributed noble estates employed improved farming techniques, while the growth of market towns provided commercial centres that facilitated exchange between rural producers and urban consumers. The demographic changes that accompanied political and religious transformation included substantial population movements, as Protestant families emigrated to territories that offered religious tolerance, while Catholic settlers arrived from other Habsburg domains and German territories. These migrations created new ethnic and religious compositions in many regions, while introducing different cultural traditions and economic practices that would influence Bohemian development for centuries. Parish records from throughout Bohemia document these population changes, while revealing the gradual linguistic shift from Czech to German in many areas where new settlers established dominant cultural patterns. The death of Emperor Charles VI on October 20, 1740, precipitated the most serious succession crisis in Habsburg history, while creating unprecedented opportunities for European powers to challenge Austrian dominance in Central Europe. The pragmatic sanction that Charles had spent decades negotiating with European courts theoretically guaranteed his daughter, Maria Theresa's inheritance of all Habsburg territories, including the Bohemian crown. However, the document's legal validity faced immediate challenges from multiple claimants who possessed alternative dynastic justifications for their territorial ambitions. Frederick II of Prussia emerged as the most immediate threat, launching his invasion of Silesia in December 1740 with an army of 27,000 troops that employed advanced military tactics and superior artillery to overwhelm Austrian defensive positions that had not been adequately prepared for sustained warfare. The Prussian occupation of Silesia demonstrated both the effectiveness of Frederick's military reforms and the fundamental weaknesses that had developed within Habsburg defensive capabilities during the peaceful decades following the Turkish Wars. Prussian forces employed disciplined infantry formations, equipped with improved flintlock muskets, and supported by mobile artillery units that could rapidly concentrate firepower against specific targets. The Prussian army's organisational structure incorporated lessons learned from contemporary European conflicts, including standardised drill procedures, effective supply systems, and medical services that maintained unit strength during extended campaign operations. Archaeological evidence from Silesian battlefields reveals the extensive use of iron cannonballs and musket ammunition that demonstrated the industrial capabilities Frederick had developed to support his military ambitions. The Battle of Mollwitz on April 10, 1741, provided Frederick with his first major victory against Austrian forces, while revealing the tactical innovations that would characterize Prussian military success throughout the subsequent conflicts. The Prussian infantry's disciplined volleys proved devastatingly effective against Austrian cavalry charges, with coordinated musket fire creating killing zones that traditional mounted tactics could not overcome. Austrian forces, commanded by Field Marshal Neuperg, employed conventional military methods that had proven successful during previous conflicts, but proved inadequate against Prussian tactical innovations. The battle's outcome confirmed Prussian control over Lower Silesia, while demonstrating to other European powers that Austrian military weakness created opportunities for territorial gains that had been impossible during Charles VI's reign. Maria Theresa's response to the Silesian crisis revealed both her personal determination and the institutional strengths that enabled Habsburg recovery, despite initial military disasters. The young Archduchess, only 23 years old when she inherited the throne, possessed limited governmental experience but demonstrated exceptional political instincts that enabled her to navigate the complex diplomatic and military challenges that threatened to dismember her inheritance. Her appeal to the Hungarian Diet for military support, delivered personally in September 1741 while holding her infant son Joseph, created powerful emotional responses that transcended the constitutional limitations that had previously constrained Hungarian assistance to Austrian causes. The Hungarian nobles' enthusiastic response to Maria Theresa's appeal provided crucial military resources that enabled Habsburg resistance to continue despite Prussian occupation of Silesia and French threats to Austrian territories in Italy and the Low Countries. The Hungarian Diet authorised substantial troop levies and financial contributions, while Hungarian noble cavalry units provided mobile forces that could operate effectively in the diverse terrain conditions that characterised Central European warfare. These Hungarian contingents included approximately 40,000 troops, whose military effectiveness reflected both traditional Magyar martial traditions and recent organisational improvements that had been implemented following Ottoman conflicts. The broader European coalition that formed against Maria Theresa during 1741 and 1742 included France, Bavaria, Saxony, and eventually Spain, creating military pressures on multiple fronts that tested Habsburg administrative and financial capabilities to their limits. French forces invaded Austrian territories in the Low Countries, while Bavarian troops, supported by French auxiliaries, advanced toward Vienna through Upper Austria. The coordination of these multiple threats required sophisticated diplomatic arrangements among the Allied powers, while their military operations demonstrated the strategic vulnerabilities that had developed within the Habsburg defensive system during decades of relative peace. The election of Charles Albert of Bavaria as Holy Roman Emperor in January 1742 represented the most serious challenge to Habsburg imperial authority since the medieval period, while creating constitutional crises that threatened to permanently exclude the dynasty from imperial leadership. Charles Albert's coronation as Charles VII provided the anti-Austrian coalition with imperial legitimacy for their territorial claims, while his Bavarian base offered strategic positions that threatened Austrian communications between their German and Italian territories. However, the new emperor's limited financial resources and dependence on French military support created fundamental weaknesses that Habsburg diplomacy would eventually exploit to restore their imperial position. The Bohemian campaign that accompanied the imperial election demonstrated both the continued loyalty of Bohemian territories to Habsburg authority and the effectiveness of defensive strategies that Maria Theresa's advisors had developed to protect their core territories. French and Bavarian forces that invaded Bohemia in 1741 initially achieved significant success, capturing Prague in November and establishing temporary control over much of the kingdom. However, their inability to maintain adequate supply lines during winter operations created vulnerabilities that Austrian forces exploited through systematic harassment of enemy communications and supply depots. The Austrian recovery of Prague in December 1742 marked a crucial turning point in the war, while demonstrating the resilience of Habsburg authority when confronted with existential threats. The Austrian assault on French and Bavarian positions employed coordinated infantry and artillery attacks that exploited enemy weaknesses created by extended siege operations and inadequate winter preparations. The recapture of Prague eliminated the most serious threat to Habsburg control over Bohemian territories, while providing Maria Theresa with secure bases for continued resistance against the European coalition that had formed against her inheritance. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 concluded the War of Austrian Succession with territorial arrangements that confirmed both Habsburg survival and the permanent loss of Silesia to Prussian control. Maria Theresa's acceptance of Silesian loss represented a pragmatic recognition of military realities, while her retention of all other inherited territories demonstrated the effectiveness of Habsburg resistance despite overwhelming initial disadvantages. The treaty's provisions regarding imperial succession restored Habsburg control over the Holy Roman Empire, while establishing Francis Stephen of Lorraine, Maria Theresa's husband, as Emperor Francis I through arrangements that preserved Habsburg dynastic interests within modified constitutional frameworks. The administrative reforms that Maria Theresa implemented during the 1750s and 1760s represented systematic efforts to strengthen Habsburg governmental capabilities while addressing the institutional weaknesses that had been revealed during the Succession War. The establishment of new bureaucratic procedures created more efficient tax collection systems, while standardized administrative practices reduced regional variations that had previously limited governmental effectiveness. These reforms included the creation of professional civil service positions that required educational qualifications rather than noble birth, introducing merit-based advancement that attracted capable administrators from diverse social backgrounds. The military reforms that accompanied administrative modernization reflected lessons learned from Prussian tactical successes while incorporating Austrian strategic requirements that differed from Prussian offensive capabilities. The establishment of new military academies provided professional training for officer candidates, while standardized drill procedures improved unit coordination and battlefield effectiveness. These reforms included the adoption of improved firearms and artillery that could match Prussian military technology, while organizational changes enhanced logistical capabilities that had proven inadequate during recent conflicts. The economic policies that Maria Theresa developed during the 1750s demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between commercial development and military capabilities, while addressing the fiscal constraints that had limited Habsburg responses to external threats. The encouragement of manufacturing industries through tax incentives and protective tariffs created domestic production capabilities that reduced dependence on foreign suppliers while generating employment for urban populations. The improvement of transportation infrastructure, including road construction and river navigation projects, facilitated commercial development while enhancing military mobility that proved crucial for territorial defense. The educational reforms that characterized Maria Theresa's reign reflected both Enlightenment influences and practical recognition of the need for educated populations capable of supporting modern governmental and military institutions. The establishment of compulsory primary education created literacy levels that enabled more effective administrative communication, while providing foundations for advanced technical training that supported manufacturing development. The expansion of secondary education included new curricula that emphasized practical subjects including mathematics, natural philosophy, and modern languages that prepared students for careers in governmental service or commercial activities. The religious policies that Maria Theresa pursued throughout her reign balanced her personal Catholic devotion with practical recognition of the need to accommodate religious minorities within her diverse territories. The gradual relaxation of restrictions on Protestant worship reflected both Enlightenment influences and strategic calculations regarding the advantages of religious tolerance for commercial development and population retention. These policies created new opportunities for religious minorities while maintaining Catholic institutional dominance that satisfied conservative elements within Habsburg territories. The abolition of serfdom that Maria Theresa initiated during the 1770s represented one of the most significant social reforms in Central European history, while addressing economic inefficiencies that had limited agricultural productivity throughout Habsburg territories. The new legal arrangements granted peasants personal freedom and property rights, while establishing cash rent payments that replaced traditional labour obligations. These changes created incentives for agricultural improvement, while generating increased tax revenues that supported continued governmental modernisation. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements throughout Bohemia reveals extensive construction projects undertaken by newly free peasants who invested their increased earnings in improved housing and agricultural facilities. The succession of Joseph II in 1780 brought to power a ruler whose Enlightenment convictions and reformist ambitions would transform Habsburg territories through systematic implementation of rational governmental principles. Joseph's co-rule with his mother during the previous 15 years had provided him with extensive administrative experience, while his travels throughout European intellectual centres had exposed him to contemporary philosophical developments that influenced his approach to governmental reform. The new emperor's personal commitment to Enlightenment principles created unprecedented opportunities for comprehensive social and political transformation, while his determination to implement reforms rapidly generated resistance from conservative elements who preferred gradual change. The Edict of Tolerance that Joseph issued in 1781 represented the most comprehensive guarantee of religious freedom in contemporary European history, while eliminating legal disabilities that had previously restricted Protestant and Orthodox Christian communities throughout Habsburg territories. The edict granted religious minorities the right to build churches, establish schools, and participate fully in commercial and professional activities while maintaining Catholic institutional privileges in areas where they possessed historical precedents. These provisions created new opportunities for religious minorities, while demonstrating Joseph's commitment to rational governmental principles that prioritized administrative efficiency over traditional religious distinctions. The administrative reforms that Joseph implemented during the 1780s created uniform governmental structures throughout Habsburg territories, while eliminating regional privileges that had previously complicated imperial administration. The establishment of German as the sole administrative language simplified bureaucratic procedures while creating career opportunities for educated individuals, regardless of their ethnic backgrounds. These language policies generated resistance from Hungarian and Czech nobles who viewed them as threats to their cultural autonomy, while practical implementation required extensive retraining of governmental personnel who had previously conducted business in local languages. The judicial reforms that accompanied administrative modernization established uniform legal codes throughout Habsburg territories, while eliminating torture and other cruel punishments that Enlightenment philosophers had condemned as violations of human dignity. The new legal procedures emphasized evidence-based prosecution, while providing defendants with rights that had been absent from traditional judicial systems. These reforms created more predictable legal environments that facilitated commercial development, while demonstrating Joseph's commitment to rational governmental principles that treated all subjects equally regardless of their social status. The economic policies that Joseph pursued during the 1780s reflected physiocratic influences that emphasized agricultural development while reducing traditional restrictions on commercial activities. The elimination of internal trade barriers facilitated economic integration throughout Habsburg territories, while new tax systems based on land values rather than social status created more equitable revenue collection. These policies generated increased governmental revenues while creating incentives for agricultural improvement that enhanced food production throughout the monarchy. The resistance to Joseph's reforms that developed during the later 1780s reflected both specific grievances regarding particular policies and broader concerns about the pace and scope of governmental transformation. Hungarian nobles organised systematic opposition to language requirements and administrative changes that threatened their traditional privileges, while Belgian territories erupted in revolt against religious policies that restricted Catholic institutional authority. These resistance movements demonstrated the practical limitations of enlightened reform when implemented without adequate attention to local traditions and interests. The Czech national awakening that began during Joseph's reign represented both response to his linguistic policies and broader cultural developments that had been fostering ethnic consciousness throughout Central Europe. Czech intellectuals, including Josef Dobrovsky and Josef Jungmann, began systematic efforts to preserve and develop Czech literary traditions while creating modern educational materials that could compete with German cultural dominance. These scholarly activities created foundations for Czech cultural revival while demonstrating the unintended consequences of Joseph's administrative uniformity that had sought to eliminate ethnic distinctions. The death of Joseph II in February 1790 brought his brother Leopold II to power during a period of unprecedented crisis, as revolutionary upheavals in France created new ideological challenges while internal resistance to Habsburg reforms threatened territorial disintegration. Leopold's brief reign focused on restoring stability through careful modification of Joseph's most controversial policies, while maintaining essential administrative improvements that had enhanced governmental effectiveness. The new emperor's diplomatic skills enabled successful negotiation of compromises with Hungarian and Belgian opposition movements, while his death in March 1792 prevented full implementation of his stabilisation programmes. The succession of Francis II in 1792 coincided with the outbreak of revolutionary wars that would transform European political relationships while creating existential threats to traditional monarchical authority throughout the continent. The young emperor inherited territories that remained destabilised by recent reform efforts, while facing military challenges from French revolutionary forces that employed new tactical methods and ideological motivations that differed fundamentally from traditional European warfare. The Habsburg response to these challenges required mobilization of resources on unprecedented scales, while diplomatic efforts sought to create effective coalitions against French expansion. The French Revolutionary Wars that dominated European politics during the 1790s created repeated military crises that tested Habsburg defensive capabilities, while demonstrating both the strengths and limitations of the administrative reforms that had been implemented during previous decades. Austrian forces employed traditional military methods that proved initially effective against revolutionary armies, but gradually lost effectiveness as French forces developed new tactical approaches that exploited the revolutionary enthusiasm of their troops. The series of military defeats that Austrian forces suffered during the 1790s revealed fundamental problems in Habsburg military organisation, while creating political pressures that would influence subsequent governmental policies. The Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797 concluded the first phase of revolutionary warfare with territorial arrangements that confirmed Austrian loss of Belgian territories while compensating Habsburg losses through acquisition of Venetian territories that had been eliminated by French conquest. These territorial exchanges demonstrated both the Habsburg capacity for diplomatic adaptation and the broader European transformation that was eliminating traditional political structures throughout the continent. The treaty's provisions regarding imperial arrangements created precedents for constitutional changes that would ultimately lead to the Holy Roman Empire's dissolution. The resumption of warfare in 1805, following Napoleon's assumption of imperial authority, created new military challenges that would test Habsburg capabilities against the most sophisticated military organisation in contemporary European history. The Grande Armée that Napoleon assembled for his Austrian campaign employed organisational innovations and tactical methods that had been developed through years of continuous warfare, while French industrial capabilities provided equipment advantages that traditional Austrian manufacturing could not match. The campaign that culminated in the Battle of Austerlitz demonstrated both Napoleon's tactical genius and the fundamental obsolescence of traditional European military methods when confronted with revolutionary innovations. The Battle of Austerlitz on December 2nd, 1805, represented one of the most decisive military encounters in European history, while demonstrating Napoleon's ability to coordinate complex tactical manoeuvres that exploited enemy weaknesses with devastating effectiveness. The French victory eliminated the Third Coalition while forcing Austria to accept territorial losses that included substantial Bohemian territories that were transferred to Napoleon's German allies. The battle's outcome confirmed French military supremacy, while creating political circumstances that would necessitate fundamental changes in Central European political organisation. The Treaty of Pressburg that concluded the 1805 campaign required Austrian acceptance of territorial losses that eliminated traditional Habsburg influence in southwestern German territories, while confirming Napoleon's dominant position within the European political system. The treaty's provisions regarding imperial arrangements created constitutional crises that threatened the Holy Roman Empire's continued existence, while French pressure on German princes encouraged their withdrawal from traditional imperial obligations. These developments created circumstances where imperial dissolution became inevitable despite centuries of constitutional tradition that had connected Central European territories through imperial authority. Francis II's proclamation of the Austrian Empire in August 1804 represented his attempt to preserve Habsburg imperial dignity while adapting to changing European circumstances that threatened traditional imperial structures. The new imperial title provided constitutional frameworks that could accommodate the loss of Holy Roman imperial authority, while maintaining Habsburg claims to imperial status within their hereditary territories. These arrangements created new relationships between Habsburg rulers and their subjects, while eliminating the complex constitutional obligations that had characterized Holy Roman imperial governance. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire on August 6, 1806, concluded over 8 centuries of imperial history while marking the definitive end of medieval political structures that had governed Central European development since Charlemagne's coronation. Francis's abdication of the Holy Roman imperial title reflected both French pressure and practical recognition that the empire's constitutional foundations had been irreparably damaged by revolutionary warfare and territorial changes. The formal dissolution eliminated legal frameworks that had connected diverse German territories while creating opportunities for new political arrangements that would characterize 19th century European development. The transformation of the Kingdom of Bohemia into a crown land of the Austrian Empire represented both constitutional change and practical continuity, as Habsburg administrative structures remained largely unchanged despite new imperial arrangements. Bohemian territories retained their historical boundaries and traditional administrative institutions, while new imperial frameworks provided legal contexts that accommodated the elimination of Holy Roman constitutional obligations. These changes created new relationships between Bohemian institutions and imperial authority, while preserving cultural and administrative traditions that had developed over centuries of Habsburg rule. The conclusion of this transformative period marked the end of Bohemia's existence as an independent kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire, while establishing new constitutional foundations that would govern its development throughout the modern period. The administrative, social, and cultural changes that had occurred during the 18th century created institutional frameworks that would influence Bohemian development for generations, while the elimination of traditional imperial structures opened possibilities for new forms of political organisation that would characterise subsequent European history. The kingdom that had emerged from Slavic tribal origins in the 6th century achieved royal dignity under the Premyslids, survived the religious upheavals of the Hussite period, and adapted to Habsburg rule had been transformed into a component of a modern European empire, marking the end of one historical era while establishing foundations for the challenges and opportunities that would define its future within the broader Austrian imperial system.